And we're back with another big review breakdown from the Fantasy for Real podcast, a show that breaks down more football games on a weekly basis than any 2-hour podcast should. I'm going to sound like a broken record that's patting itself on the back somehow, but I think this is a good show today. I added a bit more organization to the NFL section, and so I'm hoping it is mostly the same, but maybe a little bit more organized and easier to follow. We're going to target some big picture injury news. We're going to talk about some big idea segments in terms of maybe who we're buying or selling at this point of the year. And then because this show's main focus is with prospects in particular, we're going to focus on the rookies and sophomores most of all in the NFL section. We're going to do rookie and sophomore heroes. We're going to do rookie and sophomore zeros. And then we're going to do rookie and sophomore quarterbacks. So obviously the quarterbacks might fit in a couple categories there, but that way we're covering the younger players on the NFL slate most of all. After that, I'll get into any smaller notes I might have. Once I get to the college football portion of the show today, we're going to do mostly the same thing we do every week, talking about the risers and fallers. Particularly for this week, what the heck are we doing about the 2025 quarterbacks? That said, if you play in one quarterback, this was a great weekend for the draft class, I would say. Not only did some high upside sleepers perform well, but some top level talents with huge upside had big weekends too. So we'll have all that and more coming up on the show here soon. And before I get into that, I also wanted to just say that if you have any comments or thoughts about the length of the show, please feel free to let me know those either on the social medias, either at FFB for real on Twitter or X at FFBFORREAL. In general, my initial idea was to kind of have shorter shows than these ones have ended up being, but when I go and make my notes throughout watching football on Saturday and Sunday, they end up getting a little bit longer than I intend, but I also feel like we're talking about a good enough number of subjects that it's not just a ramble of 2 hours where we're not talking about too much. I feel like we're hitting a good number of things, so if you agree, if you don't agree, let me know, but with all that said, let's take a short break, or at least I'll take a pause, and let's get into the NFL portion of the show today, starting with our injury news before we get into our major buys and sells, talking about, once again, Kenneth Walker, David Njoku, and Tyrone Tracy. If you are hearing this, I've slipped this 30-second edition into the YouTube cut. I'm going to try to get back to posting this version of the show with at least this kind of background with a couple of visual bits of information. Maybe we'll go full video at some point, but for right now, I think this is the maximum of where we're at. I wanted to post the wide receiver rankings from a few weeks ago on this channel last week as well, but I haven't quite made that video yet, but I likely will do that soon as well. But for right now, I wanted to get back to releasing the new content from the Fantasy for Real podcast. So this episode is brand new, just released today, Tuesday, and while it is long, if I've done it correctly, there should be timestamps for any particular situation or player you're interested in listening to. So with that said, let's get into some injury news, keeping in mind that this podcast was recorded before Monday Night Football. On the NFL portion of the show today, as I mentioned in the introduction, I'm going to be making these segments a little bit more official this time to make the section a little bit more organized. This is kind of just me trying to make the show a little bit better and better each week. Don't know if that'll work this week, but here we go with a bit more of a sectioned off NFL section for today's show. We will start with some injury news, go into my big picture topic for the show today. Then we will go into rookies and sophomores, the heroes, the zeros, and the quarterbacks from this past week of NFL football. And then after that, I will go over any other notes I might have. So we had two pieces of major injury news break since this show last recorded, and really three, but one of them was kind of before the show was released. But anyway, and one's not really as major either, I guess. But getting into the first one, Brandon Ayuk here, the wide receiver, obviously for the San Francisco 49ers. Now, on my timeline, this hasn't actually been confirmed yet, but we're going to assume that he is out for the season with a torn ACL. Obviously, Juwan Jennings, Ricky Pearsall, Jacob Cowing are three players who potentially could step up into this. I didn't plan on having much to say about these injuries. I just want to make sure that we cover them a little bit on this show. And it's kind of interesting to think about Ricky Pearsall's value, just because if you thought Ayuk wasn't going to be a big problem for the short term, you ended up going through a really roller coaster process that also included Ricky Pearsall getting shot, and you ended up at pretty much the exact same place. But anyway, that's all I have really on the Brandon Ayuk injury, other than to say that injuries are not a reason to declare yourself right or wrong. And it's also worth noting that things could have really changed this season without the injury. But Brandon Ayuk was one of my favorite values in the offseason at the wide receiver position. The only reason he didn't make the all undervalued team was because of the conflict of where he would play. And I consistently said that if he were to play in San Francisco, that is when he would be on the all undervalued team. Obviously, that is aged very poorly. We can blame it on the offseason, schedule, or however you want to phrase it, with Ayuk and the contract negotiations. But regardless, even though it does have a little bit to do with injury, he was not playing well before the injury. In fact, this was something, I guess why I'm probably saying it is this was something I was planning on talking about on the show anyway. And despite the fact that he did get injured, it doesn't really excuse the fact that there were some serious questions going on before the injury happened. I mean, he had a huge drop in this game. So Brandon Ayuk, definitely a miss on the all undervalued team, out for a year at this point. Won't talk nearly as much about Deshaun Watson, especially because, how much is changing? Usually when we go from a proven starting quarterback to a kind of murky backup situation, we say things like, well, okay, I know you haven't been putting a lot of faith in this guy, but his backup's not going to be better. And he's probably not going to be the same either. But in this situation, with how poorly Deshaun Watson is playing, I mean, there's a lot of people who genuinely believe that the only reason Deshaun Watson was continuing to start and not having any threat of being benched was the fully guaranteed contract. So now that that is out of the way, there's no real reason here for me to think that that's too much different going on. And while he has had fantasy upside in the past, I don't trust even Jameis Winston enough to believe that he is necessarily an upgrade for any of these players. So I don't see it as an upgrade. I don't see it as a downgrade. We will talk about the big Browns tight end, David Njoku, in just a little bit here. But that's really all I have for Deshaun Watson. I don't really have anything to talk about when it comes to that guy at this point. He is out. He is out for a long time. I do not know what this means for the rest of his career. Maybe this is the last time we have to talk about him. That wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But moving on to the third season-ending injury, the one that happened not this past weekend, but 2 weekends ago, and just happened to not be announced when we were recording the last Thursday show, and that is Rashid Shaheed, the wide receiver for the Saints. Obviously, Shaheed is not as big of a name in general, but he's a fairly big name on this show. We've discussed him quite a bit as a potential value and his ascension with his increased target shares. And he is someone who is still a talent that I like quite a bit, though I am a little bit worried about this because this season just felt like it might have just been a lightning in the bottle season for Shaheed, or at least had the potential of being that. And that's not to say he can't be a consistently good player either when he comes back or just in general, but this seemed like a situation where for one reason or another, it seemed like he was in a really good position where he was the number 2, which is a really nice place to be for a talent like him, where he's not getting the highest degree of coverage, but he's also not in the kind of Jameson Williams perspective where he can easily become the third or fourth in a week. He was very clearly the number 2 at this point, and even the number 1 on a fairly frequent occasion, at least in terms of, the most involved in the offense. And then you also had a quarterback in Derek Carr who had at least good enough numbers and was willing to feature him in the offense a good bit. So I still have faith in Rashid Shaheed at least being a solid wide receiver going forward, but I don't know what to expect. I don't know if I should be expecting wide receiver 3 production when he comes back next year, whenever that may be, or lower than that. And obviously there's going to be big situational changes, but I guess what I'm saying is that Shaheed is the kind of player where an injury is going to spike him down quite a bit on the values, because there was a lot about this season that felt like it could prove something. And, even if it's just a case of he doesn't get that opportunity as quickly as he was getting it this season, because maybe they're a little unsure and bring in someone else, well, that alone disrupts our timeline enough that it really messes with the value. That is why injuries are, as much as this is Dynasty and we play forever, injuries are a reason to knock people's values when they occur. Sometimes they get overknocked, sometimes they get underknocked, but it is something to at least consider, and Rashid Shaheed is a player who I am a little bit worried about what this does to his value. This isn't really related to Rashid Shaheed, but I also wanted to say really quickly that this game was a really good reminder that just when a player gets injured mid-game, that changes the game plan in a way that is very different than if a team goes into a game knowing that a player won't be there. So, I mean, I don't know. You be the judge. Maybe I'm trying to get partial credit for this. I don't know. But the reason that I really quickly just said, like, Shaheed should get a lot of targets and moved on last week was because I was kind of saying that in response to the contrast between him and Bub Means, who was already, even before the Shaheed announcement as being officially out happened, Bub Means was getting a lot of credit. And Bub Means very well could be the guy moving forward, but the reason that I was so into Shaheed there, and it was on the quick hit, so we didn't really talk about it that much, is that when a team has a full week and knows what they're gonna have, and especially when they have a rookie quarterback, so they're taking a lot out of his hands, the wide receivers that are the most likely to get featured are probably the ones that have been the highest on the depth chart. As much as chemistry is a real practical thing that we have to consider, and we can say that, like, Rattlers played with Means a lot in, like, the second team and in the preseason, and all that's very real. But if they're designing a game plan for a rookie quarterback, there's a good chance that they're going to design the most targets for the guys that they think are the best. And internally, it seems pretty obvious, based on how they list the depth charts and such right now, that those guys are Mason Tipton and Cedric Wilson Jr. And we especially saw this past weekend. And so, as much as Wilson got the touchdown, if I am chasing between these two players, at least right now, for who I'm picking as the number 2 behind Olave, when Olave is healthy, and let's just assume Derek Carr gets back, so there's reasonable volume here. It's not Spencer Rattler, but also we have Shaheed gone. In that case, I do think I'm chasing the targets and taking Mason Tipton. I have both of these players in the exact same single league, so no real bias here in terms of Cedric Wilson and Mason Tipton. But Mason Tipton is the one that I would chase between the two because, again, he had the 9 targets. And then this isn't really much of an injury note, but just because, kind of like Shaheed, he's a player that we talk about a lot on the show. Demario Douglas seems to have been struggling with some kind of illness in the London game. So I don't know whatever to make of something like that, especially for a discussion point analytically, because it's kind of like, what do you make about it? What do you think when you hear that a player is sick? Considering that I don't have any kind of inside information on that, I still think Demario Douglas is probably a player that I am starting in deeper PPR leagues, and even most PPR leagues maybe, depending on the bye situations that are coming up here soon. But that is all I had for the injury-related notes on the show, keeping in mind, once again, that this show is always a little bit delayed on the injury information. That's a bigger deal for the Thursday show than this show, but it's still true for this show as well. And so now we're going to get into the second part of the show, kind of what's going to be the big idea portion of the NFL section most weeks. And I'm going to ask myself this week on the show, how far is too far? And we're going to ask ourselves, how far is too far with 3 key players, Kenneth Walker III, David Njoku, and Tyrone Tracy Jr. And so to be clear, the idea of, especially the way some of these questions are framed in this segment, is to be a little bit bold with the way I'm talking. But everything I'm about to say in this segment, I do believe in terms of how we can start ranking these players. So let's start with Kenneth Walker III. So if you follow my writing as well as this show, you know that most of the writing I do is in college football. But the one piece I've been getting real close to writing in some way, even though I think the main reason I haven't is I think a good portion of the market has caught up, is just, does the Ryan Grubb offense put Kenneth Walker III in the running back 1 conversation? Not necessarily does it make him the running back 1, but does it put him in that conversation? He did not have nearly as many targets this past weekend, but he was more efficient than he had been in some of his previous targets, and he did get a touchdown. That touchdown does show increasing involvement once again, and like we mentioned on the last show, we don't expect Kenneth Walker to finish with 100 targets. And we probably don't even expect him to finish with 100 targets on pace, like just with the missed game being the reason he doesn't get 100 targets. I don't think he's going to get 100 targets. And after this past weekend, the number did drop on the 17-game pace because he only got 2 targets this past weekend, but it dropped to a pace of 78 receptions on 88 targets. So even though 78 receptions on 88 targets is moving the scale down just a little bit, and when we're extrapolating and kind of looking at this from a pace perspective, those 88 targets per 17 games is still double his career high pace. So if we're doubling our career high pace, even if it goes down a little bit, if we're going up by 1.5 times, a player that has the dynamic ability of Kenneth Walker III getting this much more involved in the pass catching game is a very big deal. It's also worth noting that Walker has a touchdown in 4 of the 5 games, as well as 3 touchdowns in one of those games for a total of 6 touchdowns. He is also the highest graded PFF rushing grade player on the season so far. So I've talked a lot about Kenneth Walker on the last few shows, specifically this pass catching profile. So I don't really want to talk about it anymore. As much as this is the big picture portion of the show, I just want to make it clear in the buy-sell kind of idea here that Kenneth Walker, to me, is the player who, in the big picture buy-sell portion of the show today, I just want to make it clear that, like, Kenneth Walker, to me, is a player, I'm not necessarily saying that I would take him over Bijan Robinson, over Breece Hall, or over Jahmyr Gibbs. But at this point, I think he has to be in that tier, like legitimately the same grade as all of those players. If I could take any single one of those players and trade for Kenneth Walker III and something else for anyone who does not see them in the same tier, that is the move I would make. Because one thing to always note about any kind of show in fantasy sports is that, like, how the market practically moves, I don't know what you'll be able to get. I don't know what anybody else will be able to get. I don't know what you have on your roster. I don't know how many teams you play, or how many leagues you play in, rather. And so with that in mind, like, when someone says they're, like, ranking Bijan over Gibbs, and then they're saying, well, maybe I'm ranking Gibbs over Bijan, they're not saying every single week you should go out and trade Gibbs for Bijan. The real important things are the differences in tier. And so from that perspective, the important thing here is that I'm not necessarily saying Kenneth Walker III should be valued over any of these guys in particular, but I don't see a tier gap between Bijan, Breece, Gibbs, and Kenneth Walker III. And so if somebody else does, and I have one of those top three, and they have Kenneth Walker III, that is a trade I very well might make. And then on that note of important tier breaks, could David Njoku be a top 3 tight end? Now, obviously, these are, again, two players we've talked about a lot, so I'm going to try to be a little bit short with David Njoku as well, at least keeping it to the main points we've talked about on previous episodes. David Njoku had a 30% target share last week. He had a 26.9% target share this week on insane overall volume through 3 different quarterbacks. This is one of the most, if not the most, involved tight end in their offense in the NFL, and frankly, the only reason that is a hyperbole to say is Brock Bowers. If we take out Brock Bowers from the equation, I think we would be focusing a lot more on and maybe we will. This is an early show. Maybe people will throughout the week. But I think people would be focusing a lot more on how there is only one other offense in the entire NFL that is going to be running right now through the tight end, and it is in Cleveland with David Njoku. It's also important to note that, like, this is a player that we talked a lot about in the offseason because my favorite sleepers, my favorite breakouts are the wide awake variety, the kind of players where you can look at and really probably does come down to something we talked about in the last show with the 2026 and 2027 class about conventional wisdom. When the market has made up their mind about a player like Nico Collins, like David Njoku, no matter what is happening, no matter what their eyes tell them is happening on the field, those are the players that we take the longest to adjust. And you can say to yourself, like, well, how do we believe that the breakout is legitimate? And my response is, well, basically we don't have to. We don't have to because people aren't making us pay for that, right? So for example, if we just look at the last 16 games that David Njoku has played, I am actually including the 3 games, including the ones that he was injured in. I am including the postseason as well, though, in the one playoff game, and he was fairly involved in that playoff game as well, but I'm just trying to get a sense of how he's playing right now. So I'm taking a 16-game sample. In those last 16 games, David Njoku has 141 targets, 89 receptions, 978 yards, and 7 touchdowns. If you take out his 3 injury-shortened games, in 13 games, he has 889 and 6. So 13 games, 889 and 6 for a tight end. That is a full season pace. If you take out his injured games, that is a full season pace of 165 targets, 103 receptions, 1,163 yards, and 8 touchdowns. This is a line that is 20 points higher than the tight end 1 in 2023. It is a tier above what any tight end did last year. That is a 13-game sample of what David Njoku has done since about the early midpoint of last season to this point. And the only adjustment we are making from that is taking out games where he barely played due to injury. And even if we don't make out that adjustment, he is still a top 5 tight end. Now, if you told me that I had to pay for that, I would be much more concerned about the fact that I don't necessarily believe that that is his true talent level. But nobody is making me pay for that. Now, maybe they are after last weekend. It's getting there more and more. But as long as the market is stuck on this idea that, like, well, David Njoku, like, we know what he is because we knew what he was for so long, and so we're just going to keep being right forever. And because we think we're going to keep being right forever, we're going to devalue David Njoku. As long as that is a sentiment that is strongly involved in his market grade, he is going to be a target for me in places like Keep Trade Cut. And for as much as he is a late breakout at this point, he is not the oldest player for being a tight end. He is 28 this year. He has a summer birthday, so he's 28 for the full season. He will be 29 next year. That means we have a year and a half before even turning 30. So how you want to factor in age for your own build in your dynasties, I can't tell you for sure, but I can tell you this. Right now, there are only 4 tight ends in a redraft league that I would even consider giving up David Njoku for. Only 4. The first one, we're just going to get the obvious one out of the way. Brock Bowers, and this is funny because he's a rookie, and we always say the opposite about rookie tight ends, but Brock Bowers is the only tight end that I am pretty clearly taking over David Njoku, and even that one has some risk because Brock Bowers does still only have 1 touchdown. And then the other 3 are Trey McBride, who I would still put above him, and Trey McBride, if Marvin Harrison Jr. doesn't pick up the pace a little bit, we could argue Trey McBride is the number 1 of that offense right now, as well as Travis Kelce, kind of a similar situation, number 1 by default after the Rice injury, and George Kittle, not necessarily a number 1, but Ayuk being injured and Debo having some ups and downs this year might increase his stability on a weekly basis. And so George Kittle's been playing really well. But those 4 tight ends, who include 2 of the best tight ends that we've had in a long time, that include the best tight end prospect we've had, in my opinion, in a really, really long time, because I had Bowers over Pitts as a prospect, and Trey McBride, who is looking like a top perennial tier tight end. Those are the only players that I would even consider taking in a redraft league over David Njoku. So I don't know what the future is going to hold. I don't know what percentage of the breakout he's going to have, because I don't think it's going to be 100% myself. I think he's going to fall off from this breakout to some degree. But when there is a breakout that gets to the point of 10, 12, 13, 16 games, and that breakout is not being paid for by the market, those are some of the best breakouts to get, because you're essentially getting a player that you have a lot of evidence could be this upper tier player, but you're not paying for that upper tier player. And so one last question here, one more player that we have talked about considerably on the show so far. So again, we'll try to keep it a little shorter. Don't know how successful we were being with the David Njoku section, but Tyrone Tracy, should he be considered a top 20 running back in Dynasty? I should say that I started by asking top 24, and then I realized that the top 24 is like not all that hot right now, right? Like Bucky Irving is the running back 19. Braylon Allen was the running back 21 when I last checked. That was before the Sunday night game. He had like 3 carries for 6 yards on Sunday night. So maybe he's fallen since then. Chase Brown at running back 22. Tank Bigsby at running back 24. And then Tracy isn't actually that much further down from this, but the players around him, Dobbins, Pollard, Mason, Aaron Jones, Stevenson, Trey Benson. I might actually talk about Trey Benson next week because I think Trey Benson's gotten a little too low, a little bit too quickly. But all these players that I'm naming, including potentially Tank Bigsby, I'm going back and forth on that one right now. I would take Tyrone Tracy over all of these players. And if that sounds any kind of reactionary, because I said the same thing kind of about Tank Bigsby over Bucky Irving or Braylon Allen, I would just confirm that is true for both players. I would take Tank Bigsby and Tyrone Tracy over Bucky Irving and Braylon Allen. We will see how that kind of goes as things run along into the future. But I think the most important thing about Tyrone Tracy is that there are certain players where the floor feels a lot better than the ceiling. Like Dameon Pierce is a good example of this. Why Dameon Pierce going to the Texans was such a good landing spot is you put a running back who had a really high floor as a 2-down bruising running back in a backfield that had a limited amount of talent with Lovie Smith. I'm not 100% sure if Lovie was the one that drafted him, but the point is here that you put a running back that had a lot of floor in that situation, and we got to see them be good right away. But the concerns that kept them from taking over and the reasons that they went into day 3 were probably more along the lines of high upside trades. The thing with Tyrone Tracy is that all of his questions were with the floor. When it comes to most things we look for from the perspective of ceiling, he knocks those things out of the park, especially the ones that we are privy to as people that don't have all of the best like GPS monitoring tracking data. Tyrone Tracy had problems with the floor because he was a 5-year wide receiver who didn't have more rushes than receptions until his 6th year in college and didn't have 200 carries within 6 years of college. But when you talk about the traits, especially the traits that we look for fantasy as well when it comes to pass catching as well, but burst, balance, the way he tested at the 40, the way he tested at above or right around 209, 210 pounds, the way he did the explosive drills, the way he did the agility drills, right? I mean, I don't want to get too deep into the numbers here. I think most people who know the numbers know how good of an athlete he is just in general. But relative athletic score is a score out of 10 that gives an overall composite of how good of an athlete a player is. Tyrone Tracy is a 9.78 out of 10 with good size, great speed, elite explosive ability, and elite agility. The closest comp on the board for Tyrone Tracy was Miles Sanders. Now, Miles Sanders has not developed into a great running back, and some of that is part of, like, say, the pass catching traits as well, but how much of that is physical? Miles Sanders did not play very much at the collegiate level because he was behind Saquon Barkley for so long. He still went in the second round. He's also a player who, despite having numerous struggles in the league, continues to stick around. Now, I know he got the contract that kind of helps him out in that regard, but the reason people went after him with that contract was because he was seen as a higher physical upside back. That is the closest comparison to Tyrone Tracy. And again, when you look at the things that we are privy to, some of these close athletic comparisons, you look at them and they're not very close at all. This one's very close. And frankly, the only difference is that Tyrone Tracy is a little bit better, right? Like, for example, Miles Sanders had a 36-inch vert. Tyrone Tracy had a 40-inch vert. And a 40-inch vert is getting over the 90th percentile to the really special numbers. So he had more carries than Singletary. He had more receptions than Singletary, more targets than Singletary. But Singletary was coming back from an injury. So I don't want to make too much of that yet. I've seen a lot of the snap counts going around like socials. And so I get that is going to be a thing that we're talking about a lot, is how much Tracy is taking the backfield from Singletary. And to be clear, I think that is a bit of the case, but I can't be as confident in it yet. But Tracy reminds me of like Rachaad White plus, in the fact that, like, yes, Rachaad White had much better draft capital, but the late third round for me is the most overrated draft capital because we call it day 2, but it is still fairly late into the draft. And I frankly think Tyrone Tracy has a higher upside profile, especially for fantasy, than Rachaad White. So, you know, the reason that we usually don't buy into the day 3 running backs are for the lack of traits. But when you look at like a guy that has traits from day 3, like say Austin Eckler, like say Aaron Jones, I think Austin Eckler was technically a UDFA, but still, these are players that do stick around the league for a long time. And I think the day 3 stigma for Tyrone Tracy just really isn't fair, because Tyrone Tracy isn't physically limited. His limitations came from the floor, not the ceiling. And if he is taking to the game this kind of an aptitude, then that coach from the profile that we talked about way in the offseason that said way before he went to Iowa, don't go to Iowa to play wide receiver, come with me and be a running back, that eventually became his running back coach at Purdue and turned him into a running back. That guy was really right, because this guy has an aptitude to play running back that is really, really high. And if you combine that with the athletic skills, that is why Tyrone Tracy is a player that I would say rank above Braylon Allen, rank above Bucky Irving, rank above, you know, anyone in the Buccaneers room, just because he is someone who I see as someone who could become the number 1 in his backfield this year. Because as much as I think Singletary is solid, I don't think he is a giant roadblock. And then a player who could actually stick around the league for a number of years as one of the top, say, 20, 25 running backs in the league, because he has that kind of physical upside. So that is why I have Tyrone Tracy in this opening section. I don't think I've done fantasy calc trades for Tyrone Tracy yet, and many of them to me are really, really juicy. Now, I took a lot of these right after the game on Sunday, but to be fair, as much as he got snaps over Singletary, I don't know how much your market really changes when you have like 20 total yards or whatever he had this last week, and he didn't have a great game for fantasy, so I don't think his value would have changed all that much. But a couple of trades that I saw, Dameon Pierce plus a third would easily take Tyrone Tracy over that. And I think these are important ones to talk about too. Blake Corum, Jalen Wright, Marshawn Lloyd. 3 running backs who are in my top 6, the 6 running backs above Tracy going into the draft process and got drafted, all of them above Tracy, which made them higher than Tracy after the draft process. But I would move Tracy above all of them. Again, it is the things he has shown with the floor that we now can get a little bit more confident in, combined with the situation. I would move Tracy over all of these players. And then I've been a pretty big fan of Joe Mixon and his ability for a contending team. But if you were rebuilding, there was a trade, Joe Mixon for Tracy and a second. I think that is a talented running back to get along with a second. Now, I think with Joe Mixon and the way he is playing, I think that I'm big game hunting with Joe Mixon. Maybe looking for a first plus. But Tyrone Tracy and a second, I do think is a fair return and a good return for Joe Mixon, especially if you cannot find packages for anything more than, say, a contender's first. And then Tracy plus a third for Jalen Warren, or I guess I should say Jalen Warren for Tracy and a third. So obviously, Tracy is a player that I would have over Jalen Warren. So I would obviously, take more than Tracy for Jalen Warren. 2/3 is a trade I saw as well. That is something I would take. The ones that get a little rich for me are when we get into like 2 seconds. And 2 seconds, particularly if I wasn't super confident that the seconds would be at the end of the second round, that would be a hard thing for me to do. That might be the point where it's getting a little too rich. Especially once you have 2 seconds, you can really start to pair some assets up to get to some of the bigger pieces if you're willing to give up those 2 seconds. So that might be the line for me. But a lot of these deals that I'm seeing on the market, a lot of these running backs that people are saying like, well, people are overreacting to Tyrone Tracy. I'm going to get the guy who was taken in day 2, even if his situation's not as good. Those are a lot of players that I would trade for Tyrone Tracy. The Trey Benson conversation is something probably for another day because I have way too much to talk about on this show. I just noticed how low his value has gotten while looking over Tyrone Tracy. And so Trey Benson maybe going to put something on the agenda for the Thursday show to talk about him. And so that's all I have for this how high is too high section. I wouldn't necessarily put Kenneth Walker as my running back 1. I wouldn't necessarily put David Njoku as my tight end 1 or 2 in redraft leagues, though that one's probably a lot closer. And I'm not 100% sure if Tyrone Tracy is quite in my top 20 running backs in Dynasty. Really kind of depends on what your contention window is. But these are 3 players that I think are all rising, but I'm not sure if they've risen highly enough because the things that we've seen out of them should give us cause for excitement. But anyway, moving on to some rookie and sophomore takes, starting with the heroes of the week. This will focus on values that are changing or controversial. So, like for example, as much as this weekend we had great performances out of Bijan Robinson, we had great performances out of Jahmyr Gibbs, we're not going to talk about those at all. And I'm not going to talk about Brock Bowers at all either, other than just to do this fun update with his current pace, because Brock Bowers' current pace is 146 targets, 114 receptions, which would break Puka Nakua's record, 1,158 yards, 2 touchdowns, put that aside, and another 29 rushing yards. So almost 1,200 total yards, over 110 receptions. If you play in any kind of PPR, and especially if you play in any kind of tight end premium PPR format, Brock Bowers is an absolute stud on your roster. But again, enough about the big time players, though to be fair, the first name here might need to be pushed into that category very soon here, as we're going to talk about the Jaguars with Brian Thomas Jr. and Tank Bigsby. For Brian Thomas Jr., we're just going to start it off by kind of doing what we just did with Brock Bowers. Brian Thomas Jr.'s updated pace is 110 targets, 73 receptions, 1,246 yards, and almost 10 touchdowns. Brian Thomas Jr. is also running at a very, very impressive 2.6 yards per route run, which with the overall volume stats are the kind of things that make that kind of marriage between efficiency and volume that we rarely see from rookies. And when we see it, it matches up with some of the most special players in our game. I did mention this going back like over the course of the last few weeks, but a few weeks ago I said like I would still not consider trading Rome Odunze for Brian Thomas Jr. And the more I thought about it, I was kind of saying that from the perspective of Rome Odunze, because a lot of people are worried about Rome Odunze to some perspective, and I wouldn't lower him at all. But about a week later, I started thinking to myself more and more like, well, it's not really about Rome Odunze. It's about what Brian Thomas Jr. is doing. We can, let's say that Rome Odunze is like wide receiver 12 or 15 or whatever he is. I'm not exactly sure without looking through it. We can keep him at 15, or I guess maybe move him down to 16. That's pretty much the same grade. But if Brian Thomas Jr. keeps this up much longer, we have to start considering that, like, maybe we shouldn't have that big of a gap between him and Neighbors, for that matter. Because what he is doing on the season so far is, again, very special. And if he went through this process and what he's extrapolating to right now, what he is on pace for right now, and got over 1,200 yards at 2.6 yards per route run, that would be the kind of numbers that would make him probably a top 7 to 10 dynasty wide receiver. One last note on Brian Thomas Jr. I don't love to use the PFF receiving grade on its own, just purely by itself. I don't think it's as good as using some of the numbers. The only one I really like to use is the passing grade by itself, and we'll get to that in a little bit later. But Brian Thomas Jr. is now 11th among players that are around the 35 to 40 target range or more, with the only players ranked above him in PFF receiving grade being Nico Collins, Chris Godwin, T. Higgins, Terry McLaurin, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Malik Neighbors, Drake London, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Josh Downs. So I don't want to talk about that guy too much because I don't really have any plans to talk about Downs, but it is important to note that really how you make the future with Richardson says a lot about where you're willing to place Downs. Because there's a lot of indicators that he's a very, very good football player. I'm just not starting him when he is paired with Anthony Richardson. But getting back to Brian Thomas Jr. and the Jaguars, when we talked early in the season, after week 1, I think it even was, about why I was turning face about Christian Kirk, it was because of Brian Thomas Jr. And so again, I said I would stop talking about Kirk because how kind of poorly we've gotten it to an extent, but I don't think we actually got it all that poorly in terms of the season. I think it just sounded poorly. And I think that's why I'm bringing it up, is because the real bad take was the offseason. But when we changed our mind in week 1, it sounded bad. It sounded frantic. It sounded crazy to change your mind after all the positive things we had said about Christian Kirk. But it is very clear at this point that once you factor in Brian Thomas Jr. as an elite wide receiver, which is what we weren't doing in the offseason, that was certainly a part of it. But a part of it also could have been that he was the next Quentin Johnston or Treylon Burks, just based on, where he was ranked preseason. And if that would have happened, Christian Kirk would have been an amazing value. And if it was in the middle between those two things, I think he would have been a pretty good value. But when it was pretty clear from the jump that we were going to get one of the higher tier outcomes for Brian Thomas Jr. in terms of involvement and production, the only thing that kept Christian Kirk's stock high for a couple more of those games was Evan Ingram. If you include the games that Evan Ingram has played in and missed, Christian Kirk's on a pace for a little under 800 yards. And if you focus just on the games that Evan Ingram has played in, the numbers are really, really bad. That's a real small sample. It's only 3 games. But still, if you only look at the games that Christian Kirk, Evan Ingram, and Brian Thomas Jr. have played together, Christian Kirk has been a 0. So not a rookie, a sophomore, but that's just going to happen, I think, a little bit with some of these related topics. And another rookie sophomore on this team, Tank Bigsby. So Tank Bigsby, it isn't all sunshine and rainbows, though. It is positive, but it is also questions and negative. So I talked a lot of hype about Tank Bigsby, but this is an important thing to know for anybody who listens to this show in general, is that if there is one blind spot I have when it comes to running back evaluation, especially for fantasy, it is that, because I approach everything as much as I can from the NFL perspective, or at least that is part of the reason, sometimes I underfocus on pass catching, which is a problem when you consider how important pass catching is for fantasy football. And the main reason that I am starting to think, as much as I still like Tank Bigsby for some of the values that we talked about early in the show, I'm starting to think that Tyrone Tracy might have the more high long-term upside for this game, because I still probably would back Tank Bigsby as a talent over Tyrone Tracy. Part of that is the draft capital. Part of that is the way he's just been running between the tackles this year and in a pretty high volume. This game was no exception, where he had 100 yards again, he had 2 touchdowns again, he had 6 missed tackles forced again. So an incredible game between the tackles. But Tank Bigsby had one target, and I saw it, and it was bad, and it was a drop. And like, maybe I missed something because you don't see everything from the broadcast film, and I only saw the broadcast film. But I didn't see any interference that would have caused the drop. It was well set up. It was a screen. It looked like it was well placed, and it looked like it hit him right in the hands. And it looked like he just didn't catch it. And a player like that is going to find utility on an NFL field because, I mean, if you can play as well as Tank Bigsby has been playing, you will find a place on an NFL field. But, you know, he's not anything like him stylistically between the tackles. But the name that has actually started to come to mind that scares me a little bit in a Tank Bigsby comparison is Ronald Jones. Ronald Jones was a player who, you know, if anyone's a little unfamiliar, Rojo was a very good player between the tackles a lot of times when he flashed. But he was one of the worst pass-catching running backs, especially for a running back that, like, just to profile an archetype, didn't look like a terrible pass-catching running back. He was one of the worst we've pretty much ever seen. You know, on the previous show, a little bit later on this show, we talk about players like Kyron Williams and James Cook and questions about like just how good they are based on some like underlying numbers and some trends I've been seeing. But that's like a difference between like being an optimal player or being competent. When it comes to a player like Ronald Jones, we were talking about the difference between competent and like this is unacceptable. And that's kind of where we're at right now with Tank Bigsby. My general philosophy around running backs, part of the reason with these young running backs I sometimes underrate the pass catching side is that I think most running backs can learn to run a check down. It's a check down and catch the ball. You know, they can buy a jugs machine. Now I understand there's a lot of pressure on these players, so I'm not trying to, you know, make light of that. But just in general, I would look towards a player like Tank Bigsby and just expect him to put it together. But he only had one opportunity again in this game, and he showed no signs to the Jaguars that they should continue to give him those opportunities. And so the pass catching for Tank Bigsby is building into a pretty significant concern, though again, because he is such a talented player and the market price is where it's at, that is still probably making him a buy for me. And then just one last note, just to talk about how good he is playing. He has not played, obviously, a full role this year. He has played a full role basically in 2 games. At this point, he is tied for 3rd in missed tackles forced. That is not a rate stat, that is a counting stat, so it just builds up over time. So he has gotten up to tied for 3rd in that missed tackles forced stat. So sticking into the AFC, sticking with a wide receiver and a running back combination, we will be talking about rookies from the Buffalo Bills, Keon Coleman and Ray Davis. So I don't have a whole lot to say about Keon Coleman. Obviously, what we really want to see is eventual progression in being more consistent with high volume of targets and a high volume of receptions. And some of the explosive plays did come in a blowout. It is important to say that this was against the Tennessee Titans, but he showed the kind of things he can do. I don't have a whole lot to say about Keon Coleman, but I did want to get on one subject really quickly here, just from a prospect and analytical and an overview perspective. And to be clear, when I knock anybody else's opinion, it's not a showing of lack of respect. Like, the reason I follow someone like a Matt Harmon is because I think he is pretty much the best at what he does when it comes to wide receivers, especially when you just look at it as the charting, which it says it is. But Matt Harmon got on this big thing with Keon Coleman in the big slot, and that took off with a lot of other people. And I never agreed with the big slot. And the main reason, and I just want to highlight this, is this big explosive play that he had on the outside once again in this week. Because one of the traits that you take away from Keon Coleman if you put him on the inside is his ability to use his space as an explosive playmaker after the catch. He can still use it on the inside, but when he's being pushed inside towards linebackers, it is much harder. We have already seen 2 plays this year, which is only 2 plays, but we've also only played 6-7 games, and 2 ginormous plays is a pretty big deal on the NFL field. We've already seen 2 plays this year where Keon Coleman caught a ball towards the boundary line, maybe not quite exactly on the boundary line this time. The second one was much closer to the boundary line, but closer to an extreme outside section of the field. And then after breaking the tackle from the defensive back, that opens up the field in front of him quite a bit more because, again, being on the outside helps to open that up. So again, this is just a minor note, and I understand from a charting and a route tree perspective, the traits that Keon Coleman was not charting well at the college level that leads to that big slot conclusion. But a player that is as vertical and has the ability to make boundary corners miss like Keon Coleman does, I want to keep that guy on the outside because you can, we kind of talked about this on the last show with Kenneth Walker III, but this is almost a better version of it because Keon Coleman is more physically set up to take on those boundary corners. Maybe not because it's Kenneth Walker, but when Keon Coleman, you don't have to plan a screen. You can just throw it over there and see if he can make the boundary corner miss. And with his physicality, he might be able to. That is the kind of isolation that you don't get if you're sticking him in the slot every single play. And then I don't have a lot to say about Ray Davis. He did have like one big explosive carry that gave him better overall rushing stats. I believe he got into the end zone again. But the main thing I am going to continue to monitor and focus on is the pass catching involvement. The pass catching involvement is the most important thing between these two players because, again, I have been seeing some trends dating back to this offseason with James Cook that has suggested that maybe he is not as good of a pass catcher as we sometimes attribute to him. When you add to that part of the reason that Ray Davis was considered highly is because he has a very good pass catching profile. It is very easy to put Ray Davis, to see Ray Davis as a guy who might get targets over James Cook. I think because of the kind of archetype of James Cook, I think because he's this dynamic in-space playmaker, I think a lot of people are seeing James Cook as a player who is not likely to be replaced in the pass-catching role. But from what I see, Ray Davis might be the better pass catcher, even if he's not the more explosive playmaker. And frankly, he's a pretty explosive playmaker too. So if he is the better pass catcher, you might see that continue to whittle away at James Cook's role. So if he continues to get goal line carries, or carries, say inside the 10, that will help James Cook's value. But if he loses the targets, that's going to hurt a great deal. And we were already talking last week about what his target pace was. I didn't update it this week, but I believe he had 0 targets. So I can tell you one thing, it didn't go up. After that, for the rookie and sophomore heroes this week, I have Troy Franklin. Troy Franklin was the most involved wide receiver for the Denver Broncos. He had a 23.1% target percentage. So even though he only had those 6 targets, even though he had 5 for 50, when you look at it from a proportion of what his team was doing, he scored very, very highly. This is very encouraging because, all the concerns that came in with Troy Franklin, once again, this is kind of like a Tyrone Tracy type thing. They all came in with the floor. Now, we haven't really seen the ceiling. We've seen him be involved, but we haven't really seen the ceiling. But we know the ceiling is there because he does have a couple of special things that he does really, really well with his ability to stop, start, accelerate, and just be a fast on-field player. There are still significant questions there, and because the efficiency overall hasn't really been there yet, we talked about Brian Thomas Jr. at like a 2.6 yards per out run. I think Troy Franklin's still down at like 1.1. So as he's gotten involved, he's still not putting up huge numbers. Maybe part of that is Bo Nix at this level. But regardless, we haven't seen, I think, enough to really move him up. But when it comes to, say, like players in his tier post-draft for me, which post-draft his tier included players like, say, Jermaine Burton, Roman Wilson, Malachi Corley. These were players that were ranked below Troy Franklin going into the draft, but close enough that when they were drafted higher than him, it set off the difference, and they were in the same tier. But I would clearly take Troy Franklin over all those players, just given how involved he is and how much upside I see in the profile. But I still do have some questions. But again, if he continues with those 20+% target shares like he had this past week, that will be a pretty big deal. And then some brief tight end notes, starting with Ja'Tavion Sanders, who is having some fantastic early production, at least over the course of the last, say, 2 or 3 weeks for a tight end so young. He always was kind of the receiving profile, analytical kind of guy. He got involved very young as a player for Texas. He is still very young overall in this portion of the season. I had him, like last year, I had him as closer to a first-round grade. And while that is a grade that I regret because of how the process ended up and him going into the 4th round, it is still fair to say that that was based on the idea that he had fantasy upside in particular. And so we are seeing a little bit of that come to fruition so far. Now, I haven't seen enough of the Carolina Panthers play, and I would assume that this is primarily because he is being used as a dump-off player, but Ja'Tavion Sanders is just a name that I'm going to continue to monitor because he has shown enough to, again, not a lot of players in the 2nd or 3rd round often do all that much. So I'm not saying that Tyrone Sanders has done enough, but if you could look at what he's done so far and re-roll the rookie draft, you would probably take Tyrone Sanders at the very least a little bit higher. And then Tucker Kraft, big game for fantasy, not highly involved in terms of targets, only 4 targets again, but he is still kind of in this idea of the year 2 breakout. If we're looking at these year 2 breakout tight ends, they weren't necessarily dominant in every single game. He is just showing the signs of this continual progression and involvement in the offense. Whether he ends up being a low-end tight end 1 or a high-end tight end 1 still is left to be determined, but I actually do think it's pretty safe that he could be at least that mid-tier tight end 1, a very involved guy for the foreseeable future. So that gives a little bit of floor to the idea that he could also be a very good player. And he has shown a lot of good yak skills. And in this game, his big play was a diving touchdown catch. So with skills at the point of attack as a pass catcher and with skills as a ball carrier, those are 2 things that for Tucker Kraft can go a long way into making him one of these higher tier tight ends in the league. And because I have some Green Bay Packers to talk about, I think this is the point to transition from the rookie sophomore heroes to the rookie sophomore zeros of the week. Now, I don't necessarily know if this is the term I'm going to continue to use, but it's important to note that zeros is not supposed to really stick out as these players being bad in any way, shape, or form, more just represent the weeks that they had this past week. So like I said, since we're talking about the Packers, let's talk about some Jayden Reed. Jayden Reed had his first real dud performance, and we mentioned on the show that Brian Thomas Jr. and Jayden Reed are the 2 players playing really well this year that are moving up rankings, that both have a decent number of drops in the profile. But it's important to note that they are pretty different at this point in terms of the number. Now, drops aren't the most important thing in terms of just in general, but Jayden Reed has always had drops in his profile, and as much as I kind of shoot it aside on the show a couple weeks ago, I am starting to think more and more that it is at least something that we need to monitor, because while drops are not a huge deal for most players, they are an issue for some players, and they're going to be an issue for Jayden Reed if he keeps it up like this, because it's not just that he got only 4 targets and caught 2 of them, but most of the time when you don't catch a target, it is not a drop. Drops happen far less frequently than just not catching a target. But in this case, Jayden Reed did get credited, at least by PFF, with 2 drops. That means all 4 of his targets were in a position where he frankly should have been able to come down with them based on where he was when the ball got to him. I saw one of these plays myself, and while it was maybe a slightly difficult catch, it was one that he absolutely has to make, and it was an explosive play that could have been a pretty big difference for his fantasy week. So I still have a lot of faith in Jayden Reed. I expect him to be continually involved, but it's important to note that just from a statistical number, that drop percentage up to 17.1%. That is more than 1/6 of the balls that are coming his way and not being, say, interfered with in a contested situation. 1/6 of those balls that he is getting his hands on are not being caught. That is a huge number to start the year for Jayden Reed. So that is a problem. He has a skill set and an ability with his explosive plays that really, really sticks out in this offense, even this past week, if he could catch those passes. But if he doesn't catch those passes, it's not going to matter. And if he misses too many of them, you have to wonder if he's going to lose opportunity. On the opposite side of things, Romeo Doubs got his 10 targets. So I kind of joked about the squeaky wheel conversation with Romeo Doubs. The idea that Romeo Doubs was going to be the one chirping a lot, or was the one chirping a lot, I guess I should say, that will ultimately end up with him getting more targets. But setting aside any kind of idea of potential animosity, it really does seem like Romeo Doubs has been playing a lot better since the game off, and he did get 10 targets on this one. The on-field product has never matched the way that Green Bay has talked about Romeo Doubs, but they have been very high on him for a number of years, and so, or I guess, this is the 3rd year of his career. And I think Romeo Doubs is a player to continue to monitor. I just don't know if I've necessarily seen anything to change from the up and downs we've seen so far in his career. I also have Sam Laporta and Jameson Williams kind of here, and I am starting to get concerned about changes in the Detroit offense, because I was looking through Sam Laporta's numbers. I talked about his route participation on a previous show, and how he has 16, 19, 19, 24, and now 26 routes in 5 of his 6 games this season. Those are all among the lowest games of his last year, especially the 19, 19, and 16. Now, some of that is injury related, and so I don't want to get too far away from that. But I also did kind of try to control this by comparing to Amon-Ra St. Brown. And comparing Amon-Ra St. Brown in 2023 compared to 2024, Amon-Ra St. Brown's routes per game in terms of the median is down by about 9. In 2023, he was running closer to 35.5 routes per game. This year, it's closer to 26.5 routes per game in terms of the median. That is a big difference. So even if you want to say it's like a little early in the season, there does seem to be a little bit of a shift towards not even running nearly as many passing plays, probably with the health of Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery and the establishment and continued, frankly, domination of those two running backs. I've defended the idea before that like Dan Campbell is not quite as hard-nosed in terms of like his offensive coaching philosophies as the media persona. Not necessarily saying he doesn't like love to pound the football and run the football, but that he has shown a lot of modernness in the way that he has coached and organized his offense as well. But I am worried that now that he's really gotten his hooks into this team and this roster and he has the two running backs that he really wants, I am worried that is the direction this team is going to go. And Amon-Ra St. Brown seems to still be very safe, but Laporta does not seem to be, and at least Jameson Williams can get it all in one or two targets. So Jameson Williams looks like a very boom or bust wide receiver 3. And, you know, the question for Jameson Williams seems to be, is he a boom bust wide receiver 2 or a boom bust wide receiver 3? And for a couple games this season, it looked like he was going more towards wide receiver 2. But the way I am forecasting this offense right now, I have some concerns based on these route numbers. And so for right now, for me, he is a boom bust wide receiver 3. In general, this is something we will be watching with the Detroit Lions. Getting into some rookies here, Braylon Allen only had 3 touches, only went for 6 yards. He had 2 big weeks where he had 18 total attempts, 7 total targets, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but 9 attempts and 3.5 targets per game as a backup running back, when you have at least decent yardage, 2 touchdowns over that span, that's pretty decent for a backup. But, you know, as someone who wasn't as high on Braylon Allen in the preseason, I mentioned at the time that as impressive as he was, there's a difference between things that get you excited if you were a fan of his and things that change your mind if you were not. And Braylon Allen didn't really do anything that changed my mind. And since that point, he has been on a significant downward trend in his usage. 8, 5, 3, and now 2 carries and 1, 2, 2, and 1 targets. If you put those together and say opportunities, call them each an opportunity, Braylon Allen has gone from 9 to 7 to 5 to 3 opportunities in the last 4 games. So essentially going down those odd numbers. I don't have a whole lot to say here. He is still a player who has a lot of upside if Breece Hall goes down, but the conversation about him being a viable player without Breece Hall going down, that is dead and buried at this point, because anyone who is having 7, 5, 3 opportunities in the last 2-3 weeks, that's just not going to be very viable. So we will see if he can look a little bit more like he did in that 2-week stretch, if he gets more opportunities down the line. But right now, it's just important to note that usage trend makes him completely unplayable regardless of your situation if Breece Hall is healthy. And then Xavier Worthy, again, I don't say like these things. I say them just because to me, part of the process is knowing where you're coming from to know kind of how you got to where you are right now. And so I don't bring this up in the duds to make any kind of statement about this show's, you know, record in the past. We've made plenty of misses. And it's also not a victory lap because I'm not saying that this is going to be, you know, what these guys' careers look like. But we had a lot of concerns about what Xavier Worthy's translation would look like to the NFL outside of, say, like a Tavon Austin-y gadget role. In this past game, he had 8 targets, but only caught 3 of them. He only had 1 carry, and he had 24 total yards. So far in the season, he has 21 targets, 12 receptions, 179 yards, and 2 touchdowns. The 57.1% catch percentage is a little bit of a concern, especially with how many short targets he's getting. And he's only on pace in total for 59.5 targets and 507 yards. This is, again, in a situation where there's a lot of injuries with these wide receivers. It's also worth noting that if you're looking at fantasy outputs, his fantasy output is better than what we would expect so far because he's had for lack of a better term, touchdown luck. So far, 18 touches in his career with 4 touchdowns. That is a good number. But in the first 4 weeks, he had a maximum of 4 targets. The real concern to me is what's happened in the last 2 weeks when he has seen the ramp up. In the last 2 weeks, he has seen his targets ramp up from 4 to 6 to 8, 6 and 8 targets, the last 2 weeks for a total of 14 targets. And in those last 2 weeks, he has only a 42.9% catch percentage, catching less than 50% of his targets, 44 yards on 14 targets, which is a really, really poor 3.1 yards per target. And he also has 0.72 yards per out run. So I'm not necessarily moving values, but that's also, again, because my priors were just a little bit lower on Xavier Worthy. If you were expecting Xavier Worthy, especially after the injury of Rashee Rice, to blow up and be the number 1 for this team, it still could happen. Just because we're not getting good indicators for it right now doesn't mean it won't happen. But the ramp up that Xavier Worthy has gotten the last 2 weeks, it is important to note, has not translated to success for the Kansas City Chiefs, is not translated to success for fantasy. And so right now, Xavier Worthy is a player that we're just monitoring for, frankly, general performance. I also have CJ Stroud and Tank Dell here. We're not going to talk about CJ Stroud. I know he's having a down year in terms of fantasy performance. I know that, it's looking like Nico Collins is actually pretty important to this offense, but CJ Stroud's a really good player. And the reason he was valued where he was in the offseason was because of the talent and because of the longevity. And neither one of those things has changed, even if the outputs, which were the things we were actually questioning in the offseason, even if the outputs aren't what we want. So if you're in a dynasty league, especially if you're in a 1 quarterback dynasty league and you were relying on Stroud, it's probably rough right now. And it's probably rough if you were relying on him as a top quarterback in a super flex. But I'm not going to make anything of it. The one player that you could make something of is Tank Dell. Now, it is important to note that he has been through a lot, right? Like he was shot in the offseason. That's before we get into the fact that he's recovering from a broken leg. But aside from those differences, which are very strange and different in the profile, there were a lot of similarities between Tank Dell and Elijah Moore. And I think just the one point I want to make, because I don't want to spend too much time on this, and we're going way too long on this NFL section today. But the one point I want to make about Tank Dell and young receivers who have something that is not ideal, like Tank Dell's size, is that proving that you can succeed when you have a negative is the thing more than anything else that needs to be shown over time. Being able to succeed as a small guy for a short period of time is very impressive, but it's nothing like being able to consistently do it week in, week out for years. And obviously, like for years, we're never going to know if players do that until they do that. But Tank Dell's streak of being awesome is still very small. It's small enough that he only has 700 receiving yards coming into this year. So, he was very impressive last year, but I do think there were some profile similarities there that I am looking over. There was a touchdown pass from Stroud that Tank Dell frankly should have caught this weekend in the back of the end zone that he did not come down with. So there are some performance related things going on with Tank Dell right now, just from what I've seen alone, without using things like coaches film, without using things like, the all 22 for these NFL games, at least right now. But Tank Dell is definitely a player that I'm a little bit concerned about because I think he came into the season as being a little bit too proven of an asset. He was an exciting asset, but he shouldn't have been considered a proven asset. And I'm still excited about him as an asset, which is why if he falls any further, and maybe even where he is right now, he might become a buy for me. Because once we get past the proof and into just the excitement, I think there's a lot of reasons to be excited. But in general, there's not a lot of reason to feel safe right now. With Tank Dell, there's not a lot of reasons to feel like you can play him consistently, even with Nico down. So kind of moving into the quarterback section of this rookie sophomore section of the show today, though to be fair, the first quarterback really qualifies as a bit of a zero. Spencer Rattler was just kind of not ready for this situation. Maybe it's Jay Kaner. Maybe he gets another shot moving forward if Derek Carr is not ready to go. But, the one thing we talked about on the show the most is that, I don't think I really put it this way, but people really overrate how much your ability to avoid sacks has to do with your physical mobility, right? I mean, Tom Brady was one of the best players at avoiding sacks over a very, very long portion of time just because of subtle movement. as well as the ability to, preempt what the defense is going to do or recognize things as or just before they begin to happen. There were a lot of indicators that suggested that the Saints' offensive line was playing like crap and that Derek Carr was making the most out of it by getting the ball out quickly and avoiding those sacks or avoiding those pressures turning into sacks. It's not like we would expect Spencer Rattler to play like a seasoned veteran, but he was clearly not ready for that pressure, and he took 11 sacks in the last 2 games. He was also pressured 20 times this weekend, which was more by about 3 than any other quarterback, at least according to PFF. So, there's not a lot to say really, because this isn't like a first-round player, obviously. It's a day 3 player. A lot of times when we're finishing off these players, we're going between like why you should or shouldn't move your values. And the reason you shouldn't move your values, or I guess the reason most people shouldn't move their values on Spencer Rattler, is because he was always a very, very long shot, and he's still a very, very long shot. Now, I guess why I hesitate there is if you were one of the people who really believed there was a good shot, or at least a reasonable shot, that Spencer Rattler would just, displace Derek Carr right away, you should probably, change the value based on what's been happening here, because it does seem like the 5th round draft capital was warranted for Spencer Rattler. But in general, like, this isn't what should make us change our value. Our value should have probably started pretty low with Spencer Rattler. But a couple guys drafted in the 1st round that the value shouldn't have started low on because they were, again, drafted in the 1st round with some at least good profile things. We're going to talk about Bo Nix and by extension Caleb Williams, because there's just kind of some overlap here and I don't want to ignore Caleb Williams for fairness. But Bo Nix continues to show some signs as a passer, some positives as a player, and also some mobility that we always knew was there, but we hadn't really seen it involved, especially in the Oregon years, the last 2 years. And so seeing that mobility engaged with his short passing game has really been eye-opening as at least one more way that Bo Nix can create upside. But it's also important to note that he is still, we've been talking about these areas outside the short game, and he's been playing a little bit better deep. So I'm really not trying to nitpick. I just do think it is something to monitor and continue to watch. Bo Nix is still awful in the intermediate area of the field. Again, those passing ranges between 10 and 19 yards. So I adjusted the amount of dropbacks so that we could get 32 quarterbacks in the sample. So the 32 quarterbacks who have played the most this season. And among those 32 quarterbacks, Nix was last in intermediate PFF passing grade, intermediate completion percentage at 33.3%. He's completed 1/3 of his passes into this area, 5.7 yards per attempt, and 5 turnover-worthy plays. So again, small sample, small area of the field, so to speak. Nitpick kind of, this is kind of a nitpick, but there's a difference between taking a specific like this and changing a profile or knocking a player significantly, and taking something like this and just saying, we're going to put this on the board and watch it a little bit. And that's what we're doing right now with Bo Nix. But then the reason that I kind of tie this in with Caleb Williams is I didn't want to talk about how Bo Nix was the worst at intermediate passes, while kind of completely overlooking the fact that Caleb Williams is the worst quarterback in football at the deep passes, at least as of right now. So Caleb Williams, worst graded passer on deep ball by PFF, and then both of them, under pressure grading is a very volatile statistic. It changes very quickly, and you're generally supposed to be pretty bad at it. But Bo Nix and Caleb Williams are both pretty bad at this number. Bo Nix is 26th out of 32 quarterbacks graded with against pressure, and Caleb Williams just slightly better at 24th. So they're not at the very bottom of the leaderboard when it comes to playing under pressure, but they are not playing well under pressure so far this season. Again, under pressure is just this really weird statistic that's kind of hard to use and talk about because it is both volatile and not very sticky. It is very likely to change a lot, but it also is a skill. It is an ability that players need to get. It is just like the performance and the grading is going to be very volatile because, if you have 2 or 3 bad plays where you're making interceptions that you shouldn't have made, that's going to change the grading an awful lot. And if you avoid those 2 or 3 plays across, say a year, half a season, that's going to help it quite a lot. So this under pressure grading is, as a grade, very volatile, but as an ability, it is something that we need to see these players take a step forward in. And then Drake May had some really good flashes, moved the ball a little bit, did have some issues with that. But the number one thing I think is very encouraging here is the way he avoided pressure. So, because once again, avoiding pressure is not a pure statement about your mobility. And when it comes to most players in this class, or most players in general, I usually have a pretty good idea about how I feel about their pressure to sack ability, but Drake May was kind of the exception, because there are times where it seems where he is very smoothly moving away from pressure and recognizing it and moving correctly away from that pressure. There are also times where it seems like he's drifting a little bit, where he's not stepping up, and where he just outright is missing a player on the blind side in particular and lacking a little bit of that awareness. In this game, he really showed the ability to avoid those pressures that we really want to see from Drake May. He only had 2 sacks despite being pressured 17 times. So again, Spencer Rattler was pressured 20 times. So not every pressure is created equally, but Drake May was tied for second with only 3 pressures less than Spencer Rattler, but instead of taking 5 or 6 sacks, he took 2. This really is a quarterback ability and something to give Drake May, at least in a vacuum for this ability itself, credit for. When it comes to the 27 quarterbacks who had at least 18 dropbacks, just to kind of kill some of the noise, that played in the NFL this past Sunday, or I guess Thursday as well, there were 27 quarterbacks with at least 18 dropbacks, and Drake May was 10th in pressure to sack. And on that note of not all sacks being created equally, the 9 quarterbacks ranked above Drake May in pressure to sack were all pressured less than Drake May. There were 4 quarterbacks that took 17 or more pressures, the number of pressures that Drake May did this past weekend, and they took 2 sacks, Drake May, 3 sacks, Mason Rudolph, 4 sacks, Jared Goff, and 6 sacks, Spencer Rattler. So again, all those quarterbacks with at least 17 pressures taking more sacks than Drake May. So we've seen the high upside passing ability. We need to get rid of some of the turnover-worthy plays, but the combination of the high upside passing, the mobility, and the ability to avoid these pressures and not turning them into sacks, these are 3 traits that we can really build upon for a young quarterback like Drake May. And so that is all I have for the new portions of the show today that we're doing for the NFL section that are a little bit more organized than we've done in the past. I do have quick hitting notes remaining. I'm going to try to not go too long on any of these in particular. But first one, Russell Wilson seemed to win big on Sunday night. And while I was surprised how quickly Justin Fields was replaced, again, this show has always been one of those shows that has maintained that Russell Wilson was actually pretty solid in 2023 and has always been a better quarterback outside of maybe 2022 than Justin Fields. I know Justin Fields adds a lot as a running quarterback, but you've heard me use this stat a few times if you listen to the show. My favorite passing stat for quarterbacks, it used to be yards per attempt, but now it is really taking yards per attempt and adjusting it, adding in sacks, right? I talk about with college rushing stats for quarterbacks how I hate that they include sacks, but for passing stats, I actually like that they include sacks because, sacks are part of the passing game. And more we are learning that both the sacks that a quarterback takes, as well as how far back he is and how many yards that they lose on those sacks, are both largely the responsibility and fault of the quarterback. So with this in mind, to judge overall performance, I like to use yards per attempt adjusted for sacks. By game, Justin Fields in this metric was 5.3, 5, and then 6.8, 7.4. The 6.8 and the 7.4, those are actually really good numbers. That's when he really started in that third and fourth game to really put up some good efficiency stats. But then 3.8 and 4.1 the last 2 weeks. So I know they scored a lot of points in that 4.1 yards per attempt game. That would have been week 6. But Justin Fields' efficiency was really, really bad. And so the highest number on the 6 games for Justin Fields was 7.4. In his very first game, Russell Wilson, using this metric, was at 8.7. 8.7 yards per attempt, adjusting for sacks, for Russell Wilson in his very first game with the team. That is a huge win for the Steelers, for their passing efficiency, and if it is sustainable, it will be clear that Russell Wilson is the right starter for Pittsburgh. There are a few players that I say I'm not talking about every week, and then that ends up being like a conversation about them, but just what we're saying every single week about Jackson Smith-Njigba, other than the 1 week where he played really, really well. He looks like a veteran. He looks like a good player. Is he a 700-yard guy, an 800-yard guy, a 1,200-yard guy? All those are still in the range of possibilities, but it doesn't look like we're getting good fantasy outputs, not consistently, in 2024. This is a player that I once really thought was a good use of, say, a top 5 pick in rookie drafts, and so that's going to be a big miss, even if that was a consensus miss with Jackson Smith-Njigba. And on that note of owning up to a couple of the misses here, while it is only one game, and while there are some questions there, maybe it is a good situation still. I am fully pulling back on the Amari Cooper being responsible for Amari Cooper's downfall. We talked about that on a few shows ago, and that's something that we're turning around on in this show. Yes, the drops have been concerning throughout the year, and yes, that might be still a part of his aging process and a decline that we can see. He is in his 10th season, so when a player is in his 10th season, any signs of decline, we have to take very, very seriously. But in this situation, and with this team that needs it so badly, he wasn't as incorporated into the system as Devontae Adams was, just naturally. Playing with Josh Allen, someone who he has never played with before. I mean, that's significant for these players. And so Amari Cooper is definitely a player that I think we're pulling back on any of the negativity we've put out before for Amari Cooper. We are still tracking him just as we naturally have to do with a 10th year player, but he looked really good in his debut for Buffalo. And then Calvin Ridley is another kind of mea culpa player here, and as well as last week. Because I said I thought he'd be a good DFS play. Now, I did mention I don't play DFS, and I still think the logic was there. I think the targets were there. I think the upside was there, and I'm assuming the price was fairly low. But the biggest issue was that I called Calvin Ridley an off-season buy, and he has just been ridiculously bad. And I know that is the situation around him, but that was the reason of the dip, and our what we were advocating for was buying that dip that was being caused by the Titans. So because the reasoning itself was pretty much the worst part, that is a big major L here, because the Tennessee Titans are a major reason that we should have avoided Calvin Ridley. At least that's what it looks like right now. And then Jalen Nailor of the Minnesota Vikings didn't quite make the rookie sophomore segment, but he's someone who is at least showing he can be a role player at this level for the Minnesota Vikings. Probably more of a new KJ Osborne level player, not saying 1-to-1, but still an improving football player. I actually wrote that down without actually remembering that KJ Osborne started as a Viking. But anyway, the more intriguing player that we continuously talk about on this show is Sam Darnold. And Sam Darnold had one of his best games of the season. He did have some pressure stats in terms of how he took sacks that weren't necessarily the best. He did hold on to the ball for a fairly long amount of time, and this was coming off a bye. So you figure there's a couple extra game plan wrinkles in there for Darnold. But for the most part, this is the kind of game that you look for if you are someone who believes that Darnold can be a starter for another team. And to be fair, we have been pretty negative on this show for Darnold. There is a chance that he plays again for another team. But I guess the line that I kind of want to draw here, and there's no really easy way to do this. I'm going to use PFF passing grades. I know that that's not everybody's cup of tea, but that's just what I'm going to use here. The line I'm trying to draw is the difference between kind of like what Baker Mayfield and Geno Smith have done compared to Sam Darnold. Now, I use the PFF grading, specifically the passing grading, because I believe in the way that charting is better for the quarterback, right? We can say that like it's not perfect. We can say that there are mistakes. But my counterpoint to the idea that there would be mistakes in PFF passing grade is that we talk about completion percentage, and there's nothing that goes into difficulty there. Like, obviously there is something objective, but to say that one completion, if that's all you know about him, that you know what happened on that play, like, you don't know anything about what happened on that play, to whereas at least, a highly graded play, we at least assume that the quarterback did something that the average quarterback would not be expected to accomplish. So again, there are subjective issues there. If it was a perfect world, I would like to grade every single game myself, but I can't do that. I have to rely on someone that has a staff, and the PFF passing grade is my favorite to use because you get all these reps, you get all these complications between easy throws and difficult throws, and you get such a big sample with these quarterbacks dropping back 30, 40 times a game, that ultimately I do think it evens out, and the PFF passing grade ends up being, especially in terms of a single season grading the quarterback's performance, I think it ends up being one of the more accurate grades in terms of what it actually, is trying to measure, which is the actual on-field performance of a player without using just raw stats. And with this in mind, the PFF passing grades have actually represented kind of the career arcs for all these players, right? So like Geno Smith, early on in his career when he wasn't a starter, he was hitting grades at like a 60, 63 level. When he has these past 3 years, he has been at 75.4, 82.1, and 76. Those 3 grades at 75.4, 82.1, and 76 are all very solid overall, and you see similar things with Baker Mayfield. Now, I guess I shouldn't really get into the complete numbers. They don't really matter that much. But Baker Mayfield, pretty much the same thing. The only difference is that he started his career very well with the 70s, with 180 in his first 3 years. And then the next 2 years, the last year in Cleveland, and the year that he split between Carolina and Los Angeles, those were really bad years. That's when everyone lost faith in him. But the last 2 years with Tampa Bay, he's back in the mid-70s. The problem is that Sam Darnold's PFF grades have not actually gone up at all from basically his entire career averages. To be fair, they are a little bit higher than the worst seasons of his career, but basically he played at a certain level his first 2 years, and then fell off his next 2 years, and then the last 3 years when he's been a bit more of a role, a partial role quarterback, he has picked up those numbers again when he is not playing quite as much. But the numbers haven't gone up at all this year, and they're still in that mid-60s category. So maybe this is the wrong number to look into. Maybe other people have different viewpoints on what is happening on the field. And I will say that the connection to these guys who run these modern systems, like the McVays, like the Shanahans, and they seem to like Darnold as their stopgap, I think that is an encouraging thing to look at for Darnold. But in general, to me, maybe this changes, and if this changes, this show will be the first to know. But I have seen nothing from Darnold that tells me that the performance has changed as much as the numbers. And when that happens, maybe the numbers maintain for the whole season. But generally speaking, in my experience, even if the numbers maintain in that dynamic between worst grading and good numbers, usually the team even comes around after the fact if a player's playing well and kind of says, hey, we don't actually think they're playing well. We need to find something else going on here, because their concept of judging is probably a lot closer to the charting and the grading than looking at stats. So anyway, that's what I got on Sam Darnold. One player that we haven't really talked about, but seems to be the very, very clear starter in his backfield is Alexander Mattison. So I don't have anything really to say there. He is more of a redraft running back, and redraft running backs have their place in dynasty leagues because you need running backs to play. But what you're willing to pay is probably a lot more proportional to just you having to understand, what am I willing to give up to get a win, to get 2 wins so I can make a run this year. We talked about this earlier in the show with James Cook, but Kyren Williams was not very involved in the pass catching game. He is still a very good player, and this is probably something that should be a longer conversation, and I'm doing it in the quick notes, so, a little controversy there. I'm not really trying to bury a little controversy in this show. But I still think Kyren Williams, for as fantastic as he is for fantasy, there is still a difficulty here in how to grade him for dynasty, because he is still very good, but objectively, from the things that I look at to judge skills, he is more very good, simply good, than even great, or let alone excellent. And the problem in that regard, obviously, is the fact that he is excellent, he's above excellent in one category, which is the faith that his team puts in him. And the faith that a team puts in you is one of the most important things that a running back has. But it is a hard thing to bank on, because it can change at any point with variables that we can't really chart, pay attention to, measure, anything like that. So Kyron's probably always going to lag a little bit on my rankings as long as he is, hitting more good than elite or great in a lot of these categories compared to some of these other guys. But as long as he's scoring the touchdowns, he's as good as the running back one for redraft leagues when we know he has the role. So that's all I got for Kyren, mostly monitoring there. And then one final note, let's wrap up this NFL section by talking about the exciting quarterback battle in New York. Not really, but Daniel Jones, we talked in the very beginning of the season after the very first bad game about how he might have a short leash for Drew Lock, and then we talked about how he was playing better, and so we probably didn't need to be talking about that anymore. And then like a couple of things that have happened from this show during this season, about the moment I said, well, I don't think we need to talk about this anymore. Well, there it happened again. And so Daniel Jones is benched for Drew Lock, at least, for this game. I don't know what they're going to do moving forward, but it is just something, especially because people play in deeper Superflex leagues and need every starter to be on rosters. It is something to continue to monitor because Drew Lock, it's not that there's probably much of a chance that Drew Lock is better, but again, sometimes teams just decide it is time to close the book on a chapter in their history, and Drew Lock for the New York Giants represents nothing more than a possible tank commander. But Daniel Jones, especially if they're completely ready to close the book, represents a pretty, negative chapter in a kind of run recently of a few negative chapters, especially since kind of the tail end of Eli Manning's career. But that is where we are with the New York Giants. That's all I have for the NFL portion of the show today. I will take a short break and then get into some college football. On today's show, I have some risers, fallers, 2026 players, 2027 players, and importantly, a not so nice conversation about how the 2025 quarterbacks played this past weekend. Once again, thank you for listening to the Fantasy for Real podcast. If you are following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, it would be very helpful to leave a ranked review for the show. While I know a lot of people don't do this generally and feel like it's out of their way to do it, I just want to point out that it is a free way to support the growth of the show and to also tell other people that it is worth listening to. This show has been and always will be for free, at least as long as I am able to do it. And so with that in mind, it would just help a lot to be able to go onto one of these websites and leave a review. So with that said, I will stop wasting your time and get back into the rest of the show. When it comes to the risers this week, we're going to start by going through all of my risers for the 2025, 2026, and 2027 classes. This will mostly set the 2025 quarterbacks aside, and then we will have that conversation a little bit more at the end. But the first riser, the principal riser that we're going to talk about at the very top of today's show, going to be at the top of the write-up, the player that stuck out a ton to me while watching the big game of the year potential battle between Texas and Georgia, though, in terms of games of the year, this one definitely was not the same as the first two. Trevor Etienne, the running back from Georgia, who is a transfer from Florida. Now, I don't know if he'll go on day 2, obviously, but if Trevor Etienne was to go on day 2, I have a 3-year age list of every player drafted on day 2 at our fantasy positions in the last 3 years to kind of judge how young a player is relative to, just the general players that get drafted as prospects. And Trevor Etienne would be one of the youngest. In fact, in terms of the last 3 years, only Jonathan Brooks, Drake London, and Malik Neighbors would be younger than Trevor Etienne. Trevor Etienne is a shorter running back, but he seems to have a very nice build, 5'9", 205 pounds, and he had 19 carries, 87 yards, and 3 touchdowns against Texas. So not the biggest numbers outside of the touchdown category, but against a very tough Texas defense with a quarterback who is having some struggles to, avoid turnovers. That is a very impressive performance from Trevor Etienne. Most importantly, though, there was something we talked about with Trevor Etienne in the offseason about how it wasn't a big enough volume role, and we hadn't seen enough film for it yet. But there was something intriguing about his pass catching, specifically the fact that he had caught all 29 of his 29 targets. And while, again, most of the running back, opportunities that you get are more of your simple passes, most running backs, including Trevor Etienne, or at least a lot of them, have negative ADOTs. But it still says at least something. Maybe it says a little something about the quarterback too, but it says at least something that you've caught every single one of your career targets. I mean, first off, it means you haven't dropped any of them, but you're at least moving. It might also say that you're where you're supposed to be, I guess, is what I couldn't quite put my thumb on during the offseason with these numbers with Etienne. But that's what you hope, right? You hope it says that you're reliably where the quarterback expects you to be. Well, we didn't get to see too much of that in the beginning of the season, but over the last 3 games, Trevor Etienne has 15 receptions on 15 targets, bringing his career total up to 50 receptions on 51 targets. So he did have a incompletion earlier in the season. It was his first incompletion, but his overall numbers are up to 50 of 51. In particular, it was the very first drive, the very first scripted drive of the game that I wrote Trevor Etienne's name down, not necessarily this high on the segment. I didn't know how good the game would be, but to talk about on this section of the show, because he just looked so smooth as a pass catcher and was being used so much. I believe he ultimately had 6 receptions on 6 targets in this game. So Trevor Etienne was, I believe, my running back 5 when I first did my preseason show. I didn't get too specific in my rankings, but if you read between the lines and listen to what I'm saying, he is one of several candidates for running back 5 and the one I'm kind of nudging out first and talking about the most. And at this point, he dipped kind of below Caleb Johnson and Jordan James, maybe just a little bit between the DUI, not necessarily because of the DUI offseason, but because the DUI from the offseason caused him to get off to a slow start for Georgia. It caused him to miss the Clemson game, which was a big opportunity. And Trevor Etienne's even the player that I forgot when I was doing my initial rankings, like in terms of, I really was hoping that I didn't have any omissions. I really tried to go through a couple things to make sure I didn't forget anybody in my rankings. And then as I was listening through it after I had released it, I went, crap, Trevor Etienne, I forgot that guy. And I think that's just kind of a testament to the fact that he was absent for so much earlier on in the season. But he has such a good ability to create missed tackles forced in space for a running back that has a little bit of size to him and runs the tackles pretty well. And so Trevor Etienne really, more than a lot of the running backs that have this candidacy for the running back 5, Trevor Etienne really showcases 3 down potential. I am really going back and forth for my updated 2-round. This week we're doing 2 rounds for the first time. I'm really going back and forth for my updated Superflex mock draft on if I'm going to have Trevor Etienne or Caleb Johnson as my running back 5. And then kind of an honorable mention, same position, same kind of whole category, because Dylan Sampson, the running back from Tennessee, was also maybe the biggest player in one of the biggest games for this weekend. Now, the one thing to note right away about Dylan Sampson is that Dylan Sampson doesn't seem to have quite the push as some of these other running backs do. And while he does have the missed tackles forced numbers, they don't really come from strength or physicality, right? Like Jordan James and Ashton Janty, for example, are not the biggest running backs. Like I even think they're probably a little bit smaller than Trevor Etienne, like listed size be darned. But Dylan Sampson is really the guy that I do worry about being a change of pace back in the next level. Like, not that that's a dirty word, but 5'11", 201 does kind of signal that, I talk about how BMI is not the be all end all for these measurements. And I do back that strongly, but 5'11", 201 is not a good one. And we certainly do want players to have a good one, even if it is not, the everything in size evaluation that some people treat it as at the running back position. But anyway, Dylan Sampson has a touchdown in every game. He has 17 touchdowns in 7 games. 17 touchdowns in his 7 games so far this season on the ground. He has at least 92 rushing yards in every game. He has 100 plus in all but the game that he went for 92. The only real concern, and it's not really even a concern, other than the fact that, I think he's more of a change of pace back than an early down running back. But he had 6 receptions on 6 targets in the first 2 games. Since then in the season, quite a few more games. But he only has 5 targets. He's only caught 4 receptions. We just want to see more. That's over the course of 5 games. So over the last 5 games, he's averaging 1 target a game, about, 0.8 receptions, I guess we'd call it, per game. But certainly not the numbers we want to see, especially for a guy that we think might transition to that position. So to compare him to Jalen Wright, who was a teammate of his last year, the player who played above him, I think Jalen Wright, in terms of like a testing explosiveness, in terms of like a miles per hour time, is probably the faster, more dynamic player. And I think he's built better for the NFL level. So I don't know if Dylan Sampson will be as highly regarded by the NFL. But he is fast, he is explosive, and he seems to have a lot better feel for the game. And I think that's why you see him be used in a way that Tennessee never used Jalen Wright, because I don't think they could physically lean on Jalen Wright that way, because he just wasn't as smooth as at least at that point in college, in dissecting and diagnosing and moving laterally as smoothly and as consistently as we see from Dylan Sampson. So there's a lot to like there. I just think he might be a little bit more of a change of pace. And I forgot to mention it with Trevor Etienne, but not only would Dylan Sampson be one of the youngest players in the last 3 years on day 2, he would be the youngest. He would be younger than Brooks, London, Neighbors, and Etienne for that matter. So I don't know if he'll come back. He'll come out for the NFL draft. He could go back, especially if maybe he sees signs with Nico and Josh Heupel, the head coach there, talks him into coming back and playing with Iamaleava next year and improving potential number 1 overall pick. But as of right now, Dylan Sampson is another riser for me on this list. And then for now, I'm going to skip over 2025 quarterbacks. We are going to do it on the episode today. I just want to get through the risers first because that is a longer conversation. So let's get into the 2026 class here. And I have one riser with a corresponding faller, with the riser being Makai Lemon, the wide receiver from USC, and the faller being Zachariah Branch, the wide receiver from USC. So at the end of the 2026-2027 section, we mentioned trends, and we mentioned how, we wanted to see more positive trends from some of these wide receivers. And even if they didn't have the numbers we wanted to see, if they even started to show the trends, we could at least start to get behind it. Well, it is kind of a sign of what we're kind of talking about in the 2026 class and the lack of profiles in this 2026 class that we're saying this. But Makai Lemon has put up 70 and 80 yards the last 2 games. And in this class, the way that this class is breaking down, a mid-second year player putting up back-to-back games of 70 and 80 yards, basically doubling his career receiving yards up to this point, is a big deal. So it's fascinating because Makai Lemon coming into the season was pretty much my wide receiver 4 from USC. I mean, maybe not for Devy. I don't know how I would have ranked Jacoby Lane. I don't know how I would have ranked Deuce Robinson coming into the season. Zachariah Branch would have been at the very top. But it definitely seemed like the other 3 seemed to be the ones that were getting the most snaps. And that did seem to be the case for most of the season. But now we do see Makai Lemon becoming the starting slot receiver. He did have roughly the same number of routes as Zachariah Branch, but he was marked as the starter. And so, that's really significant because Zachariah Branch is still really dynamic. He's still definitely going to play at the next level. He still has kick return, punt return upside. But this is a guy who has like 30 career receiving yards a game. And speaking to those trends, that's not 30 career receiving yards like it was really, really low and then it got raised up and up. In fact, one of the best games of his entire career was the first one. So we got no positive trends from Zachariah Branch, except for the fact, basically, and this isn't a trend, but that he was the number 1 wide receiver in his prospect class. But this position, more than any other, is about production. So if Makai Lemon on the same team is finally putting the 2026 wide receiver number 1 high school player kind of to bed, more or less, by benching him and making him the number 2 slot receiver on the team, if that's what's actually happening, then that's a huge value boost for Makai Lemon. That is a huge value dump for Zachariah Branch. And so that's just something to monitor for these Devy leagues. Maybe that's too much maybe that's overreaction to think that it's switching that quickly. But I've watched a lot of these USC games, both directly and also just kind of monitoring the games as they've gone along. And they have gotten no consistent receiving play from any of these talented guys all season. I've been asking which of these talented guys is going to step up and be able to be a consistently targeted player for this team. Is it going to be Deuce Robinson? Is it going to be Zachariah Branch? Is it going to be Jacoby Lane? And it turns out it was the guy that coming into the season was 4th on the depth chart, on a lot of those depth charts, Makai Lemon. He has been more consistent the last 2 games than pretty much any USC player has been this season. So considering the talent in that room that he is rising above, Makai Lemon, it is more of a testament to the fact that there aren't great profiles in this class halfway through the sophomore year, but Makai Lemon has to be shooting up the board right now in terms of the 2026 early declares, just because the signs of life that we are not getting from so many of these prospects who are running out of time to have good production in a relatively young age to still be early declares and have good profiles. And then not quite as much on this player, but I also wanted to mention Jeremiah Love, the running back from Notre Dame. He just looks fantastic every time I watch him. He does not have the biggest workload overall, and even in the receiving game, he doesn't have the biggest workload. But in the last 3 games, he's gone 9 for 9, 87 yards, and a touchdown. But on the season, he's gone 9 for 9 in the receiving game for 87 yards and a touchdown. And he has just looked great on those 9 receptions. He has 8 missed tackles forced on those 9 receptions. And so while not everything is, sticks out the most on the surface, while the numbers don't look the biggest or the most explosive, Jeremiah Love is a consistently impressive player to me and a candidate, frankly, the way that this class is breaking down right now, for the running back 1 of the 2026 class. So that is something important to monitor with Jeremiah Love. And then I started watching through this game, but I didn't quite watch all the Kansas State game. But Avery Johnson is a constant, like, every time he has a good game, he's just kind of a default player for this 2026 Risers class, because Avery Johnson has so much upside as a super flex quarterback. Avery Johnson is a very, very dynamic rusher, and so if he can continue to put together just even simple concepts and being able to throw with anticipation and being able to read the field well, if he can put some of these very basic building block traits and skills up on tape this year, that could make him a candidate for a very high draft pick in 2026. So not necessarily a riser, because, you know, maybe he should be, because this was one of the better games. I only started watching through the replay. I haven't quite gotten through the whole thing, so maybe it blows me away. We'll have a segment on it next show. But just the kind of player that we always want to be monitoring, and especially when he has very good weeks like he did this past week, especially when he has those very good weeks through the air, that is something to keep an eye on. And then moving into the 2027 class real quick, before we get into those 2025 quarterbacks, DJ Lagway finally arrived in the SEC, and boy, was it fun to watch. Now, depending on what stats you look for, a couple of the things that you see on the surface might not seem that blow you away, right? Because he was 7 for 14 on his completions. He had 0 passing touchdowns and 1 INT. So if you see all those numbers and you overlook or even don't even think about what it means to have 259 yards on 7 completions, you might see that and go, well, that's not very impressive. But then you realize that to have 259 yards on 7 completions, you have done some crazy things. And when you watch this game for DJ Lagway, he did some crazy things. Now let's keep in mind, he went 7 for 57 on the ground as well. This was a 48-20 team win over Kentucky, a team that was, I believe, favored to win. And if not, it was certainly close. Florida absolutely dominated them by 28 points. But most impressively, DJ Lagway had 2 10-plus carries, 5 20-plus yard passes, 4 30-plus yard passes, 3 that went at least 40 yards, and 2 that went at least 50 yards. Now, again, those are all, the same plays, but 2 of those 5 20-yard plays going for 50 yards. He had 3 big-time throws. He had 0 turnover-worthy plays. So were there inconsistencies? Sure, there were inconsistencies there. He only completed 50% of his passes. He didn't technically have a passing touchdown. Not technically. He didn't actually have a passing touchdown. Just feels weird to not have a passing touchdown when you're hitting those kind of huge explosive plays. But, these explosive plays, I'm not saying that there wasn't a single one that the defender couldn't have located or that the receiver made a great play, but these weren't just prayer balls, right? I mean, there's a difference between a prayer ball and what DJ Lagway is throwing out there, where his receivers have a legitimate shot at making good plays to get to the ball, and the corners really don't. And I'm not saying that was every play, but DJ Lagway made some beautiful throws in this game, showcased off his rushing ability. So DJ Lagway, really incredible, super flex potential, really high upside player, one of the top ranked players in the service academies. And the number one thing we said coming into the game was that we don't need him to play great. We just need him to play good enough that there's a team that pretty much plays in the SEC and the Big Ten, because that's where we're at these days, that says we want that player, and oh yeah, we're one of the playoff teams too. That is exactly what we saw from DJ Lagway. Maybe there were mistakes, but he played well enough to have explosive plays. He played well enough to spark an offense to 48 points, and he played well enough to dominate a team, despite the fact that Florida's been struggling a lot this season. So I don't know if that was enough to put the 2027 hype into the stratosphere like we were talking about, because, it's not like Ryan Williams doing it against Georgia. It's not like Jeremiah Smith being on Ohio State, which is Florida's a huge program. But with where Ohio State is, there's a lot of focus on that program, specifically with Jeremiah Love. But DJ Lagway is such a huge upside component of the 2027 class. And then just like I did before, a couple more honorable mentions here. TJ Moore is another one of the players in the category of every time I watch TJ Moore, the wide receiver from Clemson, play, I am very much impressed with him. I do believe he might have passed Bryant Wesco in total yards this year, but just to kind of give honesty and perspective, I think I might have said this on the show before, but like I have Bryant Wesco in the league. Bryant Wesco had more receiving yards than TJ Moore until recently, but as someone who's watched a lot of Clemson, I was like, dang, if I can use this receiving yard gap to trade Bryant Wesco for TJ Moore, I would do it. Because Bryant Wesco is exciting, he's explosive, he's pretty awesome. But TJ Moore looks really, really good. I listened back to my 2027 wide receiver rankings, and while I agree with the players I put in the top 5, I'd probably put Ryan Wingo too high. Ryan Wingo would be probably more my 5 than like say my 3 or 4. But TJ Moore, I think, is my 3. I think I'd have him over Coleman. I think my more thought being put into it, my top 4 would probably be Jeremiah Smith, Ryan Williams, TJ Moore, Cam Coleman, and then Ryan Wingo at the number 5. It's also worth noting that for the receiver that has a little bit more of this consistency, the comparison for TJ Moore on 247 Sports was T. Higgins, the former Clemson wide receiver as well. Obviously Higgins, great, consistent performer as that number 2, and who most people think can be a number 1 on most teams in the NFL. And then Nick Marsh is a player that I just have not given enough love for. We should have given Nick Marsh way more love after he went for 194 yards against Maryland. I don't even remember if we mentioned it on the show. I mean, that's a freshman that has a top 200 prospect grade who in one game, in his like second or third FBS game, put up more yards than most of the top 200 in the 2026 class, as we covered on the last episode. And then this past weekend, he did it again, at least in terms of having 100 yards against a Big Ten team with 8 for 113 against Iowa. So he has 2 games with 8 receptions and 100 yards against the Big Ten halfway through his true freshman season. That is incredibly impressive for Nick Marsh, and he does have at least one apparent NFL skill set in the fact that he is 6'3", 209 pounds. So I actually didn't get too many eyes on this Michigan State-Iowa game. I did not go back and rewatch this Michigan State-Iowa game. There's not, unless I'm scouting Aiden Childs, there's not a whole lot to look at other than maybe getting through Caleb Johnson a little bit more on this specific game. But just a good name to keep an eye on, someone that has not gotten nearly enough love on this show, Nick Marsh, the wide receiver for Michigan State. But now it's time to get into some 2025 quarterback class notes, and we got a lot here. Now, I don't know if it's going to take too much time. I'm going to try to get through it a little bit quickly, especially because this is a long show at this point. But this past weekend, I mean, there's no other way around it. This was a very bad weekend for the 2025 quarterback class. Even if you pick and choose some of the positives, this was a terrible week for Ewers. It was a terrible week for Milroe, and it was a terrible week for Beck. So I do usually like to start on the positive side of things, but I think because of how much there is a focus on those players, I think we need to start there. And I am going to start with the one that has not been close to the first round ranking in any of my rankings. I've talked about a lot that I have been lower on him for quite some time at this point, and that being Quinn Ewers, the quarterback from Texas. Now, Ewers can call it injury rust or something like that. I mean, I'm sure he hasn't. I'm just talking theoretically because he's coming off this injury and has a tough test against Georgia after a game against Oklahoma. But Ewers is in this position where if I was him, I wouldn't even want to bring up my injuries because durability is a major concern. So to say like, well, I wasn't prepared to play 4 weeks after I had a little, thing on my side, that's not really acceptable. But to kind of get into where Quinn Ewers is at this point in the season, when you come back for another year, you come back in hopes that you're improving your stock. And last year, Quinn Ewers was a mid-low 80s graded PFF passer. And for NFL quarterbacks, we typically want to see that number hitting about 90. Getting a little bit above 90 is the ideal. Quinn Ewers was not quite where we wanted him to be. However, and these last 2 games since the injury do weigh a ton into these numbers because that is about, 40% of the dropbacks he's had this year. But so far this year, among 100 quarterbacks in the FBS who have had the most dropbacks, I can't remember what the exact number I used for a minimum number of dropbacks, but just whatever minimum I had to set to get 100 quarterbacks on the leaderboard. Of those 100 quarterbacks, Quinn Ewers is 81st in PFF passing grade. That is not among first-round quarterbacks. That is not among draft quarterbacks. That isn't among Power 5 quarterbacks or Power 4 quarterbacks. That is among all quarterbacks. That includes quarterbacks who are going to military academies. That is among quarterbacks who are going to New Mexico schools. That is among all quarterbacks. Quinn Ewers is 81st in PFF grade out of 100. Now, he's also 93rd in turnover-worthy play percentage, and that is the number that is probably not true to his ability. He had the most turnover-worthy plays by a Power 4 quarterback in a Power 4 game, at least tied for, I think, multiple years against Georgia. I think he had like 6 turnover-worthy plays or something like that, something crazy high. So he just had a really awful single game there. But even if I don't believe that it is necessarily representative of who he is as a player, he is still sitting there with a 93rd out of 100 turnover-worthy play percentage. And then I could get over that number if there were wow throws too. The problem is that his percentage of wow throws is very, very low. He is tied for 71st of 100 in big time throw percentage. The inability to engage in those big time throws is the number one issue and concern I have and have had for a long time with Quinn Ewers. To be clear, I think there is a lot of feel, timing, accuracy, reading out simple concepts that is very vital and that Quinn Ewers does well in the Sarkisian offense. But, and I mean no offense to this if this is you, this is just my own opinion, I think a lot of people give Quinn Ewers credit for a play that really deserves to go to Steve Sarkisian. And I think that happens a lot. I think there's a lot of times where like Quinn Ewers runs right, throws back left, and people think about the run right, the throw back left, but it's just like, I mean, that was just all the play design. Like every single player on that team was flowing in a certain way and sneaking somebody back the other way. And that was the main read. And outside of that read, there was like one check down. So if the defense did pick up on it and knock it down, you just hit the check down. And to put this into the practical perspective of the Georgia game, that is what Georgia shut down. Georgia shuts down this tunnel screen game, this short passing game, this throwback game, going right to left. They really nailed these concepts and didn't allow Texas to get any traction on these concepts. And so when you have to go and play big boy football, Quinn's not good at that adjustment. I hate to phrase it that way, but that's just kind of what it is. There are so many times where I'm watching Quinn Ewers where it's like, okay, 3rd and like 9. Is he going to make a play? And in the back of my head, I'm going, no, this is going to be a check down again. Because that's what it always is on 3rd and 9. It just, is there something? No, I'm not sure. Okay, we're going to take the check down because this isn't one of our 50 design plays we run every game. I do try to keep this show mostly G, and I will continue to try to keep this show mostly G or PG for the sake of it. But if you ever play a college game with the Texas Longhorns, where you play a party game anytime they throw a check down or a short pass, you will not make it through the game. And then the problem is, I think some people somewhat acknowledge that, but in their acknowledgement of that, they still see Quinn Ewers as this physical prospect ideal. And I think a lot of that is tied to the arm, and I think a lot of that is tied to the high school prospect status. But Quinn Ewers, and I've talked about this so many times on the show, so I apologize, but Quinn Ewers is not a physical ideal. His arm is great. His physique, his mobility, his ability to run, they're not. And I was getting into a conversation with somebody on one of the socials on this over the weekend, but people will say things like, well, how do you, like, compared to who in this class? Like Shedeur, Carson Beck? And it's like, yes, because Carson Beck has functional mobility assets, like being able to move at 6'4" and put his shoulder down and truck somebody for an extra yard or two. And the fact that you would actually want to use him in a play like that. Not only is Quinn Ewers about the same mobility despite being 30 pounds lighter and shorter, but you wouldn't want to ever run him in a read option, I don't think, at this point. Because how are you going to run a guy in a read option when he's gotten hurt in the last 3 years? I mean, I think you'd just be too worried to do it when the upside isn't there on the play. So this is a guy that does have physical limitations. This is a guy that you can't use the whole playbook. If you have the whole modern playbook with all the mobility concepts and all the runs and all the read option that you're doing, aside from, the passing plays, you're not going to do any of that with Quinn Ewers. And so, you have all these limitations. if you have all these limitations, okay, then you got to be Michael Penix from the pocket. If you're going to be from the pocket, I want to see you be Michael Penix. He's not close. He's not close right now. So Quinn Ewers, I could be wrong on Quinn Ewers. Of course I could be. There are very respectable people that have pretty good grades on him. But Quinn Ewers is the one quarterback that has constantly been hyped up in this class that I just don't even see as a first-round pick or, frankly, all that close. I was open-minded to the idea that he was going to prove it to me this year because he does have enough arm talent to be a first-round pick. But I don't see it at all because of, again, the lack of mobility and basically everything that he does when you take away those schemed-up short passes. And then, because he was the opponent on the game, I think we should talk about Carson Beck next. Though Carson Beck, I think, is a tricky... If there's one of these quarterbacks that I'm going to come off as an apologist for, it is probably going to be Carson Beck. If there's one I'm going to be a hater for, it's definitely going to be Ewers, but we're already past that. I've seen a lot of people say, like, Carson Beck played as bad as Quinn Ewers or worse. And that's just not true. Like, at least not in my opinion, right? I'm not saying that he didn't make monumental, colossal, and massive mistakes. And I'm not saying he particularly played well. But I think the contrast between Quinn Ewers and Carson Beck was a quarterback making mistakes and a quarterback who couldn't do anything right. Like, that's a pretty big contrast between the two players. And with that in mind, and I think this is where we start to get into the apologist things, because to be clear, Carson Beck is not like super high on my board or anything, and he never has been. You know, he was the quarterback one in the offseason. We've talked enough about where he would actually be graded if the draft was tomorrow, which would probably be like closer to the pick 25 range for me. But I think first off, it's just important to note, we just covered how much Steve Sarkisian helps out Quinn Ewers. There is nobody helping out Carson Beck right now. Like, don't get me wrong, like Trevor Etienne, there's one guy helping out Carson Beck right now that we talked about earlier on the show because he's taking short, simple passes and making a little bit of magic with them. Outside of that, there's nobody helping out Carson Beck right now. And there's definitely a struggle when you watch his wide receivers compared to basically any other quarterback that we're talking about in this class. Every other quarterback, and it's interesting because it's Georgia, right? I mean, this has been a big problem for Georgia for a while now. But it's not just like theoretical. It's not just like looking at talent grades, because actually the talent grades are very high. Like, it's watching these players play football and just, you know, rounding out routes, not flattening things out. There's clearly times where Carson Beck is expecting them to turn around in a different way. And, you know, with somebody who relies on timing as much as Beck, these miscommunications and disconnects with the receivers, they're a very big deal. And so I don't necessarily think he's playing great football. You know, the thing I keep saying is the monkey paw, right? If not familiar, it's, the cursed wish, right? We talked so much in the first couple of games of the season about how we wanted to see more big throws from Carson Beck. Ever since then, we have seen more big throws from Carson Beck than I would have ever imagined, maybe in the entire season. But they've also come with a ton of terrible mistakes. But in this context, I wonder if some of the terrible mistakes are the result of him forcing it because he doesn't have that much faith in the pass catchers. So that is me being a little bit more of an apologist. But here's just what I'll say. And I know this is kind of a bad, scouting thing because I'm saying to set aside the game against the better defense. But if you go back, not many people watch Beck play Mississippi State because Mississippi State is not very good, and I understand that we're talking about a game against a worse defense. But some of the throws he was making, the players were covered or roughly covered by a half step. It's not like there's any real difference there in terms of where the window for the ball needs to go, and we see where he puts the ball. There are just some fantastic throws in that Mississippi State game. And there's just so many throws in that game where I'm not saying that the receiver should catch it, but they had a chance. And they had at least a decent chance. And at the NFL level, they probably should catch it. And if Beck can put balls in that place, that is going to translate to the next level. That is going to be a guy that people are still looking for at the next level. So for as much as it was a poor performance again, for as much as Beck is going to continue to have this big game, poor performance thing, and maybe that makes him more of an early second rounder, I still see Beck as someone, in contrast to Quinn Ewers, and maybe even in contrast to this next guy as well, who pretty obviously is Jalen Milroe, I still see Beck as a guy who I think could get a shot to be a starter, and I wouldn't be shocked if it panned out at all, because he has a lot of things that I think look really good and you could build on. And a lot of the wow throws, even in this time of big struggle, they've been really impressive. And he's really impressed me in a lot of the higher difficulty ways, even if the play has been far, far less consistent than it was last year. And again, maybe a little bit of that, maybe just a little bit, is not only not having Ladd McConkey and Brock Bowers, but not having suitable replacements. And then finally, Jalen Milroe. So I've talked a lot on this show about how the quarterback one in this class is something that is going to move up and down a lot, like it would be like a quarterback 3 in a couple of the most recent classes. And so if it was the quarterback 3, it wouldn't seem very weird that the quarterback 1 changed a lot. But, because we are talking about the quarterback 1 in the class, it does seem at least wishy-washy to change it so much. But frankly, I don't care about that. If all that was true and Jalen Milroe was just my quarterback 1 at times, I would still feel pretty good about it. But I will say that part of doing these gut reaction mock drafts is that we get a real close lens into when I overreact and when I don't, or, we'll see what's true by the end of the season. But right now, the one quarterback take for the entire class, really, that I am regretting this season so far is when I moved Jalen Milroe all the way up to the 6th spot in my Superflex mocks. So it's not that I put him at quarterback 1. It's not that I put him at the 10th overall pick one time. And it's not that I still probably have him at, say, the beginning of the 2nd round when I do the 2-round mock. It is the time that he got all the way up to pick 6. Because, again, I think the line that we need to start tracking on this show, at least for my personal grades, is kind of the J.J. McCarthy line. J.J. McCarthy, I think, is a really good line for a guy who I think was kind of the perfect embodiment of a quarterback I'm probably fine taking between picks, say, 12 and 20, but wouldn't actually want to pay up more than that. Because that is a very rare thing. Because most of the time when you're convinced enough about a quarterback, you're probably willing to take him in, say, like the top 10, because it's quarterback. But J.J. McCarthy was that rare quarterback that I had seen enough from to want in the first round, but not so much from that I was excited about them in the top 10. And what I'm building up to say is that this includes all the better quarterbacks we're about to talk about here. There's not a single quarterback here that I have graded as high as J.J. McCarthy. Not a single one. That includes Cam Ward. That includes Shedeur Sanders. I don't have those guys rated right now as high as I had J.J. McCarthy. They are about the same tier, and I still like them in terms of the back of the first, but this is a questionable class with some questionable guys even at the top and some depth concerns at this point. Because I think a lot of the depth that we were hoping we would have is pretty questionable, and unless we get a Klubnik or an Aller to join this class, which itself doesn't seem super likely, I think we do have some concerns here. So I just talked about the 3 big negatives, but I want to talk about a few more quarterbacks as well really quickly here. Some quarterbacks that we've talked about throughout the show. I don't want to talk about Cade Klubnik too much, but we've been tracking a lot of these key indicator stats, the same ones that we talked about with Quinn Ewers, or at least some of them, and how Cade Klubnik continues to score well in all of these indicator stats. And so once again, after another weekly performance where he wasn't great individually, but was very good individually, Cade Klubnik's numbers still look very good across the board in all these indicators, right? So I did actually write down the minimum dropbacks. I just wrote down here. So minimum 160 dropbacks gets me 100 quarterbacks at the FBS level. And out of 100 quarterbacks, Cade Klubnik is 11th in PFF pass grade, 15th in big time throw percentage, tied for 17th in turnover-worthy play percentage, and 10th in pressure to sack percentage. So he is top 17 in all of these key indicators, including creating high difficulty throws, avoiding turnover-worthy plays, and avoiding sacks. So with all these key indicators that I really like to show some of the building blocks that I'm looking for in prospects, Cade Klubnik continues to score highly on all of them while having a good time to throw and average depth of the target. On that note of pressure to sack, the most impressive pressure to sack quarterback, I think at this point in all of college football, maybe there's somebody I'm missing in the minor levels, is Garrett Nussmeier. Garrett Nussmeier has taken 1 sack this year in 64 pressures. And even in games like this past weekend,
where he is getting pressured a decent bit, he is really doing an amazing job at avoiding those pressures. There was a point earlier on in the season where we talked about this in a little bit of detail, but I said like the sample's not big enough and the tackle play is really good, so we don't really know how good he is at this point. I think at this point it is so clear and so extreme that it might be fair to say, even though we've only seen him play seven games, Garrett Nussmeier has the best pocket presence of this entire class. And I don't think that's unfair. Now that said, Garrett Nussmeier's overall performance has also been very up and down. Maybe the NFL will clamor for him because, again, he's shown some very good things. He's a talented guy. And again, this is kind of a barren class, so maybe that influences it as well. But if I was looking at Nussmeier like most prospects, I would say that he should come back for another year. And I would say that it was most likely that he would come back for another year. And I would say that it's most likely that the NFL would tell him that we'd rather see you play like 25 games than 12. Now, I don't know if that's what's going to happen, and especially when LSU has potential for the playoffs, a lot can change with Garrett Nussmeier. But right now, based on his consistency, I would recommend 2026. But he is showing some very intriguing things, including that pressure to sack. And then, not to use the same segue twice, but it is kind of a thread that ties the conversation of these quarterbacks together, talking about Shedeur Sanders, the player on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, who is by far the worst at avoiding sacks. It really is not a number. Like, I know when we talk about something like pressure to sack percentage and we phrase it like that, it makes it sound like it's purely numerical. But like, you can turn on the Colorado tape, and I believe it's either the first or second drop back of the entire game for Shedeur Sanders, and it's just a four-man rush that gets home. But it's not the fact that the four-man rush gets home, it's the fact that like no one really gets beat. And it looks like from the broadcast film, lanes and places to move. And he just kind of wades around in the pocket until he succumbs to the pressure and ends up taking that sack. And some of the times that he does react to these pressures, he is reacting late. He is turning sacks into bigger sacks. I've seen him a couple times this year make some bad intentional groundings. So that's just something to monitor with Shedeur. I don't even know if monitor is the right word at this point. It is just something in the profile. Shedeur Sanders, I think, is, when you look at Shedeur Sanders and Carson Beck, Shedeur Sanders is the best quarterback in this class if you only watched their throws. Like, if you took out everything where the play didn't end in the quarterback throwing the ball and you just showed everybody those tapes, Shedeur Sanders would have the best tape of anybody in this class. Similarly, if you did the same thing but took out the bad throws as well, Carson Beck would have the best tape of anybody in this class. But Carson Beck has a lot of bad throws this year in terms of throwing to the other team. But I really do think people underrate how, this is something that can become exponential, for lack of a better word. Because if Shedeur Sanders cannot handle a certain level of pressure, well, he's going to be under that level of pressure pretty much his entire career at the NFL level. And if he's someone who's prone to taking sacks and to turning 10-yard sacks into 20-yard sacks, maybe that is something that he can overcome at the next level, but there's not many players that can. I've seen some people say that aside from the off-field, he would be like a number one overall candidate or talked about in that way a lot more. And that's something I just simply don't agree with. It's not just the off-field. It is the fact that he does have some real danger areas and red flags in that pressure to sack, though to be fair, at this point, he is my quarterback 2, someone I am currently projecting in the first round. And then finally, the current quarterback 1 of the class for most people, and my quarterback 1 as well, though there are going to be some positives and negatives right here. Cam Ward is in many ways, Cam Ward, the quarterback from Miami, a situational riser because he had a good game with a number of touchdowns in a field where as we've talked about in great detail, Ewers, Beck, and Milroe were very, very bad. And so that gives him this benefit of being a riser in the contrast of his opposition. And he has these big growth areas that really do spell positive things for the upside, the projection of his upside that we've been talking about throughout the season. He is running more and running more frequently than he ever has in his career. He is getting those rushing yards up, which is at least good for the fantasy projection. And most importantly, he is showing growth in his big time throw percentage. On the 3 years
that he has been in college, in the FBS, at the higher level of college. He has a 1.9, 4.8, and now 7.5% big time throw percentage. So that's going up about 3% every year. That said, for as much as the high upside play of Cam Ward looks phenomenal, I do have growing concerns that, the concerns that we've been talking about in general, I just think that they're showing up more and more in the data with Cam Ward, in the fact that, I'll get to some of these specific things, I guess. So we'll just start with the pressure to sack, right? So the last 3 games were the 3 games where Miami was in very close games. And some of those were the result of, all 3 were the result of the defense, but especially in the first 2, Cam Ward made some significant mistakes in those games. And in the first 4 games of the season, Cam Ward was pressured 32 times. He took 2 sacks. That's a 6% rate. So we talked early on in the season about how this pressure to sack ratio was a very encouraging sign because that's never really been there for Cam Ward before. However, in the last 3 games, he has taken 10 sacks in 53 pressures. Now, 53 is a decent number, but 18.87% is quite a bit higher than the other numbers that we were talking about. Overall, his pressure to sack percentage on the season is 37th among the 100 qualified quarterbacks that we've been talking about throughout the show. But if you looked at him based on the first 4, he would be 4th. If you looked at him based on the last 3, he would be 65th. So he's under the halfway point when you're talking about these 3 higher competitive games. On top of that, time to throw is also a thing with Cam Ward, in the fact that his time to throws against Florida A&M, Ball State, and South Florida were all in the 2.6s. 2.6s is even kind of towards the middle of time to throws in general, but they're fairly low, especially for a quarterback like Cam Ward. But again, that was against Florida A&M, Ball State, and USF. And again, to be very clear, that first school is one school. I'm not talking about the Gators and the Aggies. I am talking about Florida A&M. His time to throws against the Florida Gators, Virginia Tech, California, and Louisville were 3.12, 2.98, 3.33, and 3.14. Among the 100 quarterbacks that we have been talking about throughout this sample, there are only 6 quarterbacks who are over 3.1. Without adjusting, without removing the 2.6 games, which are against easier competition, Cam Ward is 83rd in time to throw. Now, to be fair, everyone in that 100 quarterback sample plays easier games themselves, but still, he is 83rd in time to throw without the adjustment. And if you just looked at his time to throw against more competent teams like Florida, Virginia Tech, Cal, and Louisville, his time to throw is well over 3.1, which again is something that only 6 quarterbacks in the FBS are at. He also only had 2 turnover-worthy plays in his first 4 games. The avoiding of turnover-worthy plays was a big thing for Cam Ward. That's a half of a turnover-worthy play per game. But in the last 3 games, he's at 7. Now, 6 were in the 2 games before Louisville. He only had 1 against Louisville. But that's still 7 in the last 3 games. And when he fixed it, quote-unquote, against Louisville, when he broke the streak of multi-turnover-worthy play games, he still didn't play clean. He still had the turnover-worthy play. I think my big concern about Cam Ward, and I think I finally figured out the way to best describe it, at least in my own mind, is the fact that more and more, especially in the NFL, I think we're seeing teams really play well on that first scripted drive. And myself included, I'm looking at these quarterbacks sometimes, like some of these young quarterbacks, and when they have a really good drive on that first scripted drive, and then they fall apart for the rest of the game, I make a note of that. Like, Drake May, I think, did that in the first half against Jacksonville. He was much better on the first drive than he was through most of the rest of that game until it got out of hand. But what I'm building up to here is that Cam Ward makes some of his biggest mistakes in the scripted portion of the game, and I think that is just because I think it almost turns on his autopilot, right? Like, the point of the scripted drive is that you're rehearsing the scripted drive, right? Like, you can run all these plays in practice all week. So you've ran the same play all week. You've hit it against your defensive backs all week. But when you get to the actual game situation, you still have to read out the play. And sometimes it feels like when you get to that scripted play, when there's something that, like, more often than not, he's supposed to do, like just a 1 to 2, sometimes it feels like those are the plays
that he really gets caught up throwing like pick sixes because he's just not even reading it out. He's just chucking it. And in that regard, my biggest problem is more and more, I think we are noticing in these games when the going gets tough, he is just kind of, when he was playing well early in the season, there was an element of preempting. There was an element of being way ahead of the defense. And we saw that in the pressure to sack as well. But now I think it feels more like he's getting back to being reactive and extremely reactive in the fact that when he is not taking the thing right away, he's just kind of scrambling around and playing backyard football. And that's great. That's fine. But kind of, I know we shouldn't really make a comparison to like a true number one overall quarterback prospect. But to be fair, at this point, they are both quarterback ones of consecutive classes. But Caleb Williams had a lot of people giving him crap for off-script things in his game, for leaning on the off-script portions of playmaking too often. But both from my own watching of Caleb Williams and also from listening to other people talk about it, there did seem to be a lot of people who defended the idea that when things were there, in general, Caleb would take them. And that you could also find bits and pieces of his tape where you saw the real advanced processing things. Maybe it's just my eye. And again, this isn't my perfect expertise in terms of, breaking down the progressions. I've never been on an offensive coaching staff. I've never been a quarterback. I've never been any of these specific things. But what I can tell you just from my viewing of Cam Ward is that it is just a lot of run around and see if we can find somebody at this point, especially when things get tough. And that's something that concerns me a little bit. So, it is having these fallbacks. There's a difference between having fallbacks and always falling back on them, right? When we're talking about the difference between Bo Nix and Caleb Williams and Jayden Daniels, and why Caleb Williams and Jayden Daniels don't have to be as perfect as Bo Nix, even though Bo Nix is running pretty well right now. But anyway, they don't have to be as perfect because they have these fallbacks. But having fallbacks and falling back on them all the time are different things. And right now I am worried that Cam Ward is starting to use his easy button a little bit too much, and I don't know if his easy button is going to work at the next level, and I am worried about the way he reads things out sometimes, because when it seems like he has somebody that he is supposed to go to, it seems like he really, really locks it on. So anyway, I didn't mean to even be negative on Cam Ward, but my interpretation of some of the numbers right now aren't pushing Cam Ward into this place where he is the clear quarterback one in the sense that he is like a clear top 10 pick. They're pushing him into the quarterback one because there aren't others. I have probably at this point Cam Ward, Shedeur Sanders, and Carson Beck as my three most likely quarterbacks to go into the first round. And I still want to give some respect to Jalen Milroe because he has such a dynamic rushing ability. But in general, there's not many quarterbacks I find very likely to go in the first round, and Cam Ward is one of them that I think could be. But I think there are a lot of concerns here that are going to turn teams away from spending at the top level, and I think it is that reliance on the off-script playmaking. We will see if that is the opinion of smarter people. We'll just put it that way. That is how we'll close out the segment on the college football portion of the show today. I will take a short break and then get into any end notes I might have. All right, so this has been happening a little bit frequently on the Tuesday shows, but I'm just a little bit behind schedule when it comes to these Tuesday shows. The timeline's just a little bit tighter for me to get it out. The shows have been going just a little bit longer than I meant for them to be. So I haven't listened to the show enough to have many end notes. And the reason I have end notes, in case it's ever not clear to people, is that there's no one next to me to listen to the show. I could say something entirely wrong and not really notice it until the end because I just said the wrong word, right? So for today's episode, if you're a podcast listener, check the episode description. If you're a Substack viewer, there should be notes on the Substack. The only note I have for today is just Jalen Milroe. And that's only because I kind of realized I was doing it as I was getting out of the section. I didn't really talk about Jalen Milroe at all. I started off talking about Jalen Milroe and how we kind of misevaluated or jumped him up a little bit too highly. And that's an important conversation to have about the market. But really that conversation about quarterbacks and the J.J. McCarthy line, that should have been at the end of the segment. During that section, we should have been talking a little bit more about the performance of Jalen Milroe. So let's get into that right now. So I think the big concern for me with Jalen Milroe, to just put it in the most simple way, is that there was evidence that he was developing a lot in his ability to play within timing, and we still are seeing increasing signs of that. But a lot of those timing passes he made against Georgia seem to be a little bit the result of, frankly, just having the read preset at this point. Now, I don't know that for 100%, and again, I haven't watched that game over on all 22, but it seems more and more to me when I am watching the games, whether they be on Skycam or whether they be on broadcast, that Jalen Milroe is guessing a little bit, in my opinion, right? Like, I think one of the changes that has happened isn't necessarily that he has gotten a lot better at reading out the field, but he has gone from being timid and scrambling when he doesn't know what to do, and now when he doesn't know what to do, he's just kind of guessing. And sometimes he's just triggering, even if that player is not open, and some of the times he's triggering, he is very, very inaccurate. On a statistical side of things, what's concerning me the most is over the last 2 games, Jalen Milroe has not had a big-time throw. Even last year, he had big-time throws, and he has 4 turnover-worthy plays in those last 2 games. Not only that, he has regressed in terms of taking sacks on his pressures as well. He has 38 pressures and taken only 7 sacks, and he's still not scrambling either. There have been a couple swirling rumors about a potential injury, but those things kind of happen anytime a player gets injured because in college football, we just don't have the opportunity to have any more information than that. But, we are in the end notes now. I don't want to spend, too much time talking about Milroe at this point. There isn't really too much to get to. It really is just that factor, that element of guessing, and that fact that it is what we talked about in the last episode about this analogy to where Jalen Milroe has added something that has an ability to raise his ceiling quite a bit, but he has to figure out how to fold it into his entire game. He's playing with timing a little bit better. He's seeing a few things a little bit better, but if he's not triggering correctly enough, and if he's not knowing when he shouldn't trigger and should just tuck the ball and run, for instance, then there's a limit to how far it will go. And it's important to note that as much as he does have talent physically, we've seen players like Malik Willis go in the 3rd round. Just because he has physical talent does not mean he will go in the 1st round, and he is a 4th-year player. If he was so physically talented, he was going in the top 20 regardless, he probably would have come out for the NFL draft, especially because switching coaches, like if this was a couple different situations, maybe we don't say that. But he had Nick Saban as his head coach. Nick Saban retired, okay? If he was going to be a top 20 pick, he's probably not sticking around to stick with a head coach that plays an entirely different system instead of getting the safe thing as a 1st-round pick. So the big thing about Jalen Milroe is outside of the Georgia game, there's really no reason to believe he would be a 1st-round pick. The Georgia game is the entire reason to think he could be a 1st-round pick. And the Georgia game is a good reason for that because what players are at their maximum is a lot of what scouts are trying to look for, and is a lot what coaches are trying to get out of these players. But if for the most part, he is this guy who is not correctly diagnosing things, kind of guessing, and isn't really taking advantage of his skills in the way that we need to see, then he's probably not going to be a 1st-round pick. He's probably not going to go to a team that is setting him up to start. And if he is, maybe it is like another Titan situation that Will Levis had. Now, maybe that's not the case, and even if Jalen Milroe goes in the 3rd round, he'll have some super flex upside. But I just do think that there have been some very discouraging signs from Jalen Milroe these last couple games that go beyond just the basic things that we see on paper. I do still think that he played pretty well against Vanderbilt, but that was 2 games ago, and the South Carolina and Tennessee defenses really, really beat up Jalen Milroe. So other than that, I did have several more notes about the 2025, 2026, and 2027 classes from this past weekend of college football, but we are going to push the remaining notes from that section on to the Thursday show because we have done enough for today's show as it is. Once again, there's no time on this one for me to add the end notes to the audio version, but if there are any corrections, keep an eye out for them in the description on the podcast, the Substack post, and I will also post the corrections on the Fantasy For Real Twitter /X account at FFB For Real. That's FFB FORREAL. But with all that said, this has been Fantasy For Real. I am CJ For Real, and I will see you Thursday.